Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, the Golden Trio, are the embodiment of friendship and loyalty at Hogwarts. Yet among them, it was always Hermione Granger who was seen as the ideal. Intelligent, just, principled. But should we really place her on a pedestal of perfection? Today we'll shatter that illusion and take a closer look at Hermione from a different, more critical, yet still sympathetic angle. Ready? Let's dive in. Number 1, Hermione isn't always as insightful as she seems. Despite her impressive knowledge, Hermione often assumed that her opinion was the only valid one. Anything that didn't fit into her tidy framework of logic was met with skepticism or even mockery. Nowhere was this clearer than in her relationship with Luna Lovegood. Yes, Luna could be odd, wildly so, but her eccentricities often masked deeper truths. Harry, to his credit, recognized that. Hermione, on the other hand, was quick to shut Luna down the moment her ideas veered off script. Number 2, her intellect is, first and foremost, memory-based. Hermione was hailed as Hogwarts' brightest witch. But if we scratch the surface, much of her brilliance hinged on an exceptional memory. She mastered the art of cramming and recalling facts with surgical precision. But when it came to flexible thinking or outside-the-box problem-solving, she sometimes stumbled. Even Snape, caustic as ever, once pointed this out. And to be fair, he wasn't entirely wrong. Number 3, dismissing others' ideas was second nature. In her quest to always be right, Hermione often invalidated the opinions and ideas of those around her. Her rationality bordered on stubbornness, and her confidence in her own logic sometimes deafened her to different perspectives. Take Half-Blood Prince, for example. When Harry voiced his suspicions about Malfoy, Hermione practically laughed them off. And the result? Harry was right, and Hermione, she simply acted like nothing had happened. Number 4, her mistakes came with no consequences. When Ron or Harry messed up, Hermione was quick to point it out, complete with lectures and rulebook references. But when she was in the wrong, her missteps seemed to dissolve into thin air. Again, in Half-Blood Prince, she spent most of the year insisting Harry was wrong about Snape. When the truth emerged, there was no apology, no reckoning, just a change of subject, as if nothing ever happened. Number 5, rules are sacred unless they're inconvenient. Hermione often scolded her friends for breaking the rules, but that didn't stop her from bending them when it suited her. In Order of the Phoenix, she chastised Harry for snapping at Umbridge during their first class, but let's not forget, it was Hermione herself who had kicked off the confrontation by questioning Umbridge's authority. Hypocrisy, let's just say, a selective approach to morality. Number 6, empathy, but only when convenient. Hermione cared deeply about house elves, fought for the rights of magical creatures, and even rose to become Minister for Magic. Admirable, no doubt. But her compassion had limits. Remember when she caught Rita Skeeter in her animagus beetle form and imprisoned her in a jar? Not only did no one question it, Hermione herself saw blackmail as a perfectly acceptable tactic. A fighter for justice? Yes, but only when it aligned with her personal mission. Number 7, and lastly, Teague's tendency for harshness. What was our first impression of Hermione? A smug know-it-all who delighted in showcasing her superiority over Ron and Harry. She didn't just share knowledge, she asserted it. With age, she did mellow out somewhat, but traces of that classic know-it-all remained, especially in her interactions with Luna, Fred and George. Behind her irony lurked sharpness, and her bluntness often came off as unsolicited critique. Number 8, poor at handling criticism. Hermione believed in logic, in facts, in answers with clear structure and reason. So when someone questioned her, it wasn't just disagreement, it felt like a personal attack, especially if the criticism touched something she couldn't control. She didn't argue, she shut down or walked away. During divination class in The Prisoner of Azkaban, Professor Trelawney watched Hermione with narrowed eyes. "You do not have the right aura for this subject, I'm afraid," she said, her voice distant and dreamy. That was it. Hermione stood up, her face flushed. "If being rude gets me out of this class, I don't mind being rude," she snapped. She walked out, not just of the room, but of the entire subject. And she never came back. She didn't try to prove Trelawney wrong. She didn't explore the topic further. She didn't ask questions or reflect. Instead, she dismissed the whole subject as nonsense. Even when Trelawney later gave real prophecies, Hermione never re-evaluated her judgment. She had been doubted, and that was enough. For someone who valued learning, she had little patience for being told she had more to learn. Her friends noticed it too. When Harry tried to explain his instincts about Draco or the Half-Blood Prince, Hermione often brushed him off. "You're just being paranoid," she'd say. And when those instincts proved right, she rarely admitted it. Number 9, overly pushy. Hermione always meant well, but sometimes her help felt more like pressure. She didn't ask, she instructed, especially when it came to schoolwork. She treated Harry and Ron like reckless toddlers who couldn't be trusted with a quill. Her voice carried authority, even when no one asked for it. In The Goblet of Fire, Hermione was relentless about homework. As the boys prepared for exams, she hovered over them like a professor in training. "You're never going to pass if you don't put in the work," she'd say, snapping open a book and sliding it across the table. Harry would sigh, Ron would groan, but Hermione never stopped. She didn't notice, or didn't care, that they just needed space. Not every mistake had to be fixed. Not every hour needed to be productive. Her nagging wasn't limited to studies. When Harry wanted to sneak into Hogsmeade without permission, she begged him to stay. "You could be expelled, Harry," she hissed, eyes wide. When Ron tried to take a risk, she would lecture. Her voice followed them through corridors and into common rooms full of rules and warnings. Her concern, though real, often sounded like control. The more she tried to guide them, the more they pulled away. Not because they didn't value her, because they couldn't breathe under her shadow. Friendship isn't leadership, it's trust. And Hermione, for all her loyalty, struggled to let her friends make their own choices, even if it meant watching them fall. Number 10, intolerant of weakness. Hermione valued strength, not physical strength, but discipline, intellect, control. And when others around her lacked those things, she didn't always respond with kindness. Weakness made her impatient. Fear annoyed her. Laziness drove her mad. She didn't mean to be cruel, but her reactions could cut. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, Neville Longbottom loses the list of passwords to the Gryffindor common room. He had written them down, too many to remember, because the fat lady's portrait kept changing them. When Sirius Black sneaks into the tower using that list, the school erupts in panic. The very next day, Hermione snaps. "How could you be so stupid, Neville?" she says in front of everyone. Her voice is sharp. There's no pause for his shame, no comfort. Just blame. It wasn't just Neville. She often rolled her eyes at Ron's procrastination. "Honestly, Ron, do you ever think ahead?" she'd mutter, frustrated with his late homework or forgotten books. And while she often helped him in the end, her help came with sighs, sarcasm, and a sense of superiority. She struggled to understand that not everyone moved through the world with her sharp focus and iron will. Kindness isn't always measured in grand gestures. Sometimes it's in the small things, a soft tone, a look of understanding, a moment of silence when someone else is struggling. Hermione, for all her brilliance, often missed those moments. She didn't always see that others weren't lazy or foolish, they were simply different. And her failure to accept their flaws made her, in those moments, just as imperfect. Number 11. No respect for privacy. Hermione cared deeply, but sometimes she cared in ways that crossed lines. Privacy wasn't always something she respected. When emotions ran high, especially jealousy or frustration, she acted first and thought later. In those moments, personal boundaries meant little. In The Half-Blood Prince, Ron begins dating Lavender Brown. The relationship is clumsy and loud, but it hits Hermione harder than she admits. One day, she storms out of the common room, eyes glassy, lips pressed tight. When Ron follows her, trying to explain, Hermione doesn't speak. Instead, she casts a spell. "Opunyo!" Birds she conjured moments earlier launch at him, pecking and scratching. She turns and walks away. No explanation, no apology. It wasn't just a spell, it was a message, a punishment. Hermione was hurt, but rather than talking to Ron, someone she had known for years, she chose magic as a weapon. Her feelings were valid, her method was not. The birds weren't just dramatic, they were dangerous, and they showed how easily she crossed into someone else's emotional space without invitation. There were smaller moments too, glances over shoulders, reading messages not meant for her, asking questions that felt more like interrogations. Hermione didn't mean harm, but she often believed that if she had good intentions, the rules didn't apply. And in doing so, she sometimes made people feel exposed, vulnerable, and unheard, not out of cruelty, but out of certainty that she knew best. Number 12. Confidence. Bordering on arrogance. Hermione always knew she was smart, and most of the time she was right. But there's a fine line between confidence and arrogance, and Hermione crossed it more than once. Her belief in her own intellect often made her dismissive of others. If it didn't come from a textbook or teacher, she questioned it. Or worse, she mocked it. In The Half-Blood Prince, Harry discovers an old potions textbook filled with handwritten notes by the mysterious Half-Blood Prince. Suddenly, he's outperforming even Hermione in class. At first, she's skeptical. Then she's irritated. "You shouldn't be using that book," she snaps, watching Harry brew perfect potions with ease. But her concern isn't just about safety, it's pride. Harry is succeeding without following the official instructions, her method, and that to Hermione is unforgivable. When Harry defends the book, pointing out that the prince's tips actually work, Hermione shuts him down. "You've got no proof it's safe," she insists, even after Slughorn praises Harry's work. She refuses to admit that someone, anyone, might know better. The idea that there could be another way, another kind of brilliance, challenges her worldview. And instead of exploring it, she resists. With cold certainty, this stubbornness causes tension. Ron notices. So does Harry, but Hermione doesn't bend. She clings to what she knows because it's safe, structured, and hers. But magic isn't always logical, and brilliance doesn't always look like a neat row of facts. Sometimes it's scribbled in the margins of an old book, and Hermione, for all her intelligence, couldn't always see that. Number 13. Inability to admit mistakes. Hermione didn't like being wrong, and when she was, she rarely said so out loud. Pride wrapped around her like a second cloak, tighter than her school robes. She meant well, always, but meaning well doesn't erase mistakes. In her world, apologies came slowly, or didn't come at all. Take the firebolt. After Harry received the mysterious broomstick in The Prisoner of Azkaban, Hermione immediately suspected danger. "It could be cursed," she warned, her voice sharper than usual. Without telling Harry, she reported the broom to Professor McGonagall. The firebolt was confiscated. Harry was furious. Ron stopped speaking to her, but Hermione didn't flinch. "I was only trying to help," she said. Not, "I'm sorry," not even a pause. Even when it turned out the broom had been sent by Sirius Black, not to harm, but to protect, Hermione didn't admit she was wrong. She clung to the idea that her caution had been necessary, that her fear was noble. And maybe it was, but her silence when the truth came out hurt more than the suspicion itself. She let the rift with Harry and Ron grow, too proud to say 3 simple words. "I was wrong." This pattern followed her for years. Whether doubting Harry's instincts about Draco in Half-Blood Prince, or dismissing his beliefs about the Deathly Hallows, Hermione often positioned herself as the voice of reason, and stayed in that role even when reason failed her. Mistakes happen, they're human. But Hermione's refusal to own hers built walls where there should have been bridges. And behind those walls she stood alone, certain she had done the right thing, even when she hadn't. Number 14. Excessive perfectionism. Hermione Granger always wanted to get everything right. Her need to be perfect wasn't just about school. It was who she was. That pressure lived in her eyes every time she raised her hand in class, every time she corrected someone. She didn't want to be good. She had to be the best, and when she thought she might fail, it shattered her from the inside out. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, Professor Lupin invites students to face a boggart, creatures that take the form of one's deepest fear. For most, the fears were obvious: a mummy, a giant spider, a snake. But when Hermione stepped forward, the class gasped. The boggart transformed into Professor McGonagall, her voice cut through the air, cold and stern. "I'm sorry, Miss Granger, but you failed everything." It wasn't Voldemort, not death, not pain, it was failure. That moment said more about Hermione than any exam ever could. She wasn't afraid of monsters, she was afraid of not measuring up. Her friendships often suffered for it. During third year, she used a time turner to attend multiple classes at once, nearly collapsing under the weight of expectations she placed on herself. Harry and Ron barely saw her. She skipped meals, she snapped at friends. Her anxiety was silent but powerful. It twisted her brilliance into something sharp. Perfection haunted Hermione. It pushed her, but it also crushed her. What others called driven, Lupin might have called dangerous. McGonagall saw it too in quiet moments, how Hermione's hands trembled before exams, how her eyes scanned every book like they were life rafts. She wanted control in a world full of chaos. But the cost was her peace, and no grade, no award, no title of brightest witch of her age could give that back. Number 15. Takes on too much. There was a moment, not too grand and not too loud, buried in the chaos of Hogwarts' third year, when Hermione Granger, brilliant and determined, quietly began to crumble under the weight of her own ambition. She didn't tell anyone at first. She didn't cry in the common room or skip classes. She did what Hermione always did. She planned, prepared, calculated, and pressed forward, even when every instinct must have begged her to slow down. But Hermione Granger, at her core, believed in responsibility. She believed in being prepared. And sometimes that belief pushed her far beyond the limits of what one person could, or should, handle. In her third year, Hermione was granted a rare and dangerous magical artifact by Professor McGonagall, a time turner. It glittered like a prize, hung from a slender chain, and promised the one thing Hermione wanted most: more time to learn, more time to study, more time to be everything for everyone. With it, she could attend multiple classes at once: ancient runes at 9, arithmancy at 9:30, and care of magical creatures at 10, all without the need for compromise. But the time turner, magical though it was, did not come with the wisdom to say no. Day after day, she looped time backward, walking the corridors twice, 3 times, in a single morning. She passed herself in hallways, hiding in alcoves to avoid detection. She memorized which staircases changed at what times. She kept a strict schedule, carefully maintained, but the cost was steep. As Ron would later complain, "You're mental, you know that?" And in truth, he wasn't entirely wrong. Hermione's mind was brilliant, yes, but that year it ran perilously close to the edge. The toll this secret took on her was invisible at first. Only the observant would have noticed the deepening shadows beneath her eyes, or the way her voice grew thinner, more brittle, when answering questions in class. She snapped at Harry when he dared question her schedule. She barked at Ron when he expressed concern. "I'm fine," she'd hiss again and again, but she wasn't, not really. The Hermione who once found joy in learning was now weighed down by its sheer volume. One of the most telling signs came when Hermione, usually calm in the face of school rules, struck Draco Malfoy across the face. The slap echoed through the Hogwarts grounds. It was a rare moment of unrestrained emotion from someone who prized control. It was easy to blame it on Malfoy's endless provocations. But it was more than that. It was a momentary explosion from a mind overburdened, a release valve on a boiler ready to burst. By mid-year, Hermione had distanced herself from both Ron and Harry, not intentionally, but inevitably. They did not know the strain she was under, nor did they understand her silences or sharpness. In Prisoner of Azkaban, her frustration boiled over during a conversation in the Gryffindor common room. Just because you've got the emotional range of a teaspoon doesn't mean we all have. It was meant for Ron, but it spoke volumes of her own internal chaos. The irony was cruel. Hermione, who so often served as the moral compass of the trio, who was quick to point out when others were reckless, was herself engaging in dangerous overextension. No teacher questioned her attendance patterns. McGonagall had warned her to keep the time-turner secret, but the pressure was inescapable. She was expected to succeed, expected to master all subjects, expected to remain the smartest witch of her age. She accepted the weight because she thought she had to, because she didn't know how to say, "This is too much." Her confrontation with Professor Trelawney over divination was another crack in the surface. Trelawney's vague predictions and floating mysticism clashed with Hermione's logical mind, but her decision to quit the class wasn't just academic, it was survival. For once, Hermione recognized a boundary. It took months of silent suffering, but she drew a line. She dropped a subject. It was a small act, but a significant one, a rare moment of self-care amid a year of self-sacrifice. The use of the time-turner in the final act of that year, when she and Harry returned to save Sirius Black and Buckbeak, was a dramatic climax to an already overwhelming experience. In the hospital wing, Dumbledore hinted at what needed to be done. Hermione's face blanched. She knew what it meant. More turning back, more deception, more responsibility. And yet she did it, because Hermione always did what had to be done. They saved 2 lives that night. But as dawn broke and time righted itself again, Hermione looked exhausted, not from the task, but from the months that led up to it. Her struggle was quiet, rarely acknowledged by those around her, but it shaped her. In Order of the Phoenix, when the DA was formed, Hermione showed a more measured approach to leadership. She didn't seek glory, she didn't dominate, she organized, encouraged, facilitated. Perhaps the events of her 3rd year had taught her something vital, that helping others doesn't mean burning yourself out. Still, remnants of that overwhelming desire to help, to protect, lingered. In 6th year, when Harry grew obsessed with the Half-Blood Prince's textbook, Hermione again took on the role of the worried guardian. She scoured the book, investigated spells, argued fiercely against its use. When Ron was poisoned, she remained by his bedside. And when Lavender Brown's presence threatened their friendship, Hermione bottled her pain rather than risk the fragile balance of the trio. The impulse to hold everything together was still strong. Number 16, disrespect for other people's interests. Of all the bright minds walking the halls of Hogwarts, few shone as consistently and uncompromisingly as Hermione Granger. A student of remarkable discipline, unwavering loyalty and sharp wit, she was often the compass that kept her friends from straying too far from reason, and yet within that brilliance was a flaw that lingered just beneath the surface, a quiet, persistent intolerance for interests and passions that did not align with her worldview. Nowhere was this more visible than in her disdain for divination, a subject that to her reeked of superstition and baseless speculation. What began as academic skepticism slowly transformed into outright mockery, casting a long shadow not only over her relationship with Professor Trelawney, but also over the atmosphere in the divination classroom itself. From the moment Hermione first set foot into the fragrant, smoke-laden attic room that served as the divination classroom, she seemed out of place. Professor Sybil Trelawney's ethereal manner, her perfume-heavy presence, and her habit of speaking in riddles clashed violently with Hermione's logical, grounded mind. Rather than suspending disbelief or opening herself to the possibility of alternative knowledge, Hermione bristled with suspicion. "A lot of guesswork, if you ask me," she remarked shortly after their first class, her tone carrying more than just academic critique. It held contempt. That sentiment never softened. On the contrary, it hardened. One of the most notable incidents unfolded during their 3rd year, when the divination class attempted to read tea leaves. Trelawney had peered into Harry's cup and gasped, declaring she saw the grim, a harbinger of death. While the rest of the class murmured in discomfort, Hermione rolled her eyes and snapped her book shut with a finality that echoed louder than any spoken word. Her disdain was palpable, even as Neville spilled his cup in fright. She dismissed the lesson entirely, calling it utter rubbish without hesitation. The classroom, already fragile in its balance between curiosity and doubt, tilted further toward derision, and some students fell silent, uncertain whether their own impressions would be met with the same scorn. Hermione's intolerance didn't stem solely from arrogance. It came from a deeply rooted conviction that knowledge must be measurable, proven, and universally applicable. Anything less was a distraction, perhaps even a threat to true learning. Yet this conviction blinded her to the nuance and beauty in subjects that didn't follow conventional rules. While she revered the precision of arithmancy and the practical relevance of charms, she could not abide a discipline built upon symbols, dreams, and possibility. As a result, she forfeited any chance of growth in that realm, turning away from it with the same force she turned toward her textbooks. The damage extended beyond her own education. Lavender Brown and Parvati Patil, for instance, were among those who actually enjoyed divination. They found excitement in the mystery, wonder in the idea that the future might whisper hints through stars and smoke. But under Hermione's watchful eye, their enthusiasm withered. Parvati, who once delighted in crystal ball readings, began to whisper her interpretations more quietly, glancing nervously at Hermione before speaking. Lavender, too, seemed to shrink when Hermione scoffed at her belief that her rabbit's death had been predicted by Trelawney's omen. These girls weren't simply defending their favorite class, they were defending a part of their identity, one that Hermione routinely dismissed as nonsense. Even Professor McGonagall, a stern figure not known for coddling sensitivities, recognized the damage such scorn could do. She herself was not a proponent of divination, once calling it an imprecise branch of magic, but she stopped short of outright ridicule. Hermione, however, crossed that line without hesitation. Her refusal to even try to understand a different way of thinking reduced divination to a punchline, a course only fools would admire. And in doing so, she contributed to an environment where students felt judged not just by their professors, but by their peers. The irony was sharp. The very girl who fought tirelessly for the rights of house elves and the dignity of magical creatures could not extend empathy to fellow students who saw value in a different kind of magic. Her activism for justice did not always translate to tolerance in everyday situations. It was as though Hermione needed to be the arbiter of what was worth caring about, what was worthy of effort. If it wasn't supported by facts and data, it simply didn't deserve space in her world. This attitude was not confined to divination alone. When Luna Lovegood entered their orbit in their 5th year, bearing tales of nargles and crumple-horned snorkax, Hermione responded with sharp-edged dismissal. While Harry and Ron sometimes found Luna odd, they often listened, entertained, even smiled. But Hermione's interactions were often curt and dismissive. She referred to the quibbler as rubbish without reading more than a few lines. When Luna spoke of things that could not be seen or measured, Hermione's eyebrows would rise, her lips purse, and her hands return to her neatly annotated notes. Such responses had consequences. Luna was not easily discouraged, but others, less resilient than her, might have wilted under Hermione's gaze. There were whispers in the common room of students abandoning electives simply because they feared Hermione's judgment. In the subtle social hierarchy of Hogwarts, Hermione's opinion mattered. Her disapproval could isolate, even ostracize, and though she never intended harm, the harm was real. Her critical eye, untempered by compassion in these moments, became a blade rather than a beacon. One might argue that Hermione's approach to education was a product of her Muggle upbringing, her hunger to prove herself in a world that constantly underestimated her. But such an explanation does not excuse the rigidity with which she imposed her views on others. Magic, after all, is not meant to be bound by human logic alone. And Hermione, brilliant though she was, sometimes missed this essential truth. It's worth noting that even Dumbledore, the wisest of them all, acknowledged the value of mystery. He once said, "The truth, it is a beautiful and terrible thing, and should therefore be treated with great caution." In his world, ambiguity had value. Possibility was not weakness, it was strength. Trelawney, for all her eccentricity, made real prophecies, one of which foretold the rise of Voldemort's vanquisher. Hermione's unwillingness to acknowledge this reality until it slapped her in the face only reinforces the cost of her dismissiveness. Number 17. Controlling behavior. Hermione Granger was undeniably brilliant. She was the brightest witch of her age, a loyal friend, and a fierce protector of what she believed in. But beneath her well-meaning intentions lay a deep, often overlooked tendency, her need to control those around her. Whether it was out of love, fear, or a belief in her superior judgment, Hermione consistently crossed lines when it came to allowing others their autonomy. Her intelligence and moral compass became, at times, a weapon she wielded over those closest to her. This tendency emerged not in villainous acts, but in subtle, human moments of fear and conviction, and perhaps the most haunting example of this control was the memory spell she cast on her own parents. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, readers are offered a brief, chilling glimpse into Hermione's decision to erase her parents' memories. She casts the Obliviate spell on them, making them forget they ever had a daughter. As she explains to Harry and Ron, she not only wiped herself from their memories, but also implanted a false identity, causing them to believe they were two different people with no ties to Britain. She did this to protect them from Voldemort's wrath, knowing that anyone connected to her could be targeted, but the gravity of the act is rarely discussed. Her parents were denied agency. They were never consulted, never given a choice. "I've also modified my parents' memories so that they're convinced they're really called Wendell and Monica Wilkins," Hermione confesses in the book. "I've explained it all to them, and they think they've got to go to Australia for a conference, and that I'll see them when they get back." To most readers, it seemed an act of noble sacrifice. But from another perspective, it was a quiet tragedy. Hermione made a unilateral decision about the fate of two people she loved, convinced that her judgment superseded their right to choose. This wasn't just an act of selflessness, it was control, wrapped in the folds of good intentions. The spell was irreversible unless she, the caster, undid it. Her parents, both adults, capable and intelligent in their own right, were reduced to pawns in her secret war. It was the ultimate expression of Hermione's belief that she always knew what was best. This wasn't an isolated moment. Throughout the series, Hermione exhibited a consistent pattern of trying to orchestrate the world around her. When Harry receives his new firebolt broomstick in The Prisoner of Azkaban, Hermione, suspecting it may be cursed or sent by Sirius Black, secretly turns it over to Professor McGonagall. She doesn't ask Harry first. She doesn't even tell him. To her, the risk outweighed the importance of his feelings or the sentimental value of the gift. And when Harry and Ron are furious with her, she can't understand why they don't immediately see that she acted in their best interest. For Hermione, protection often meant overriding others' choices. Her friendship with Ron was particularly marked by this need to direct. She constantly tried to guide his decisions on school, friendships, even on how he should study or approach danger. She berated him for his laziness, corrected his spells, and took charge in most group situations. Even in moments where Ron could have learned through failure, Hermione often swept in to prevent it. Her approach to relationships wasn't malicious, but it was rooted in a fundamental mistrust that others could handle things properly without her. And perhaps on a subconscious level, she feared what would happen if she ever relinquished control. One of the most illuminating examples of this is in The Goblet of Fire, when Harry is unexpectedly entered into the Triwizard Tournament. Hermione immediately assumes a protective role, trying to control the narrative around him. She advises him on how to deal with Rita Skeeter's articles, lectures him on preparing for the tasks, and disapproves of his decisions, especially when he chooses to accept help from Sirius or Cedric. Her concern is genuine, but her tone often becomes condescending. When Harry decides to act independently, Hermione can barely conceal her frustration. It is as though she equates deviation from her advice with recklessness. Even in romantic matters, Hermione's controlling nature is evident. Her disapproval of Harry's relationship with Cho Chang is thinly veiled behind concerns about Cho's emotional stability. She subtly tries to influence who Harry should confide in, who he should trust, and how he should behave around girls. Her criticism of Ron's romantic choices, particularly with Lavender Brown, also reflects a desire to regulate even matters of the heart. While jealousy plays a part, so does Hermione's discomfort with unpredictability. Love, messy and spontaneous, is something she struggles to let happen without her input. But nowhere is Hermione's desire for control more visible than in the formation of Dumbledore's army. While Harry is its leader, it is Hermione who initiates the idea, organizes the group, creates the enchanted parchment for communication, and manages logistics. When Marietta Edgecombe betrays the group to Umbridge, it is Hermione's curse that leaves permanent scars on Marietta's face. The severity of this response shows just how far Hermione is willing to go to maintain control over what she deems sacred. The curse wasn't approved by the group, it was implemented in secret. For Hermione, justice meant preemptively ensuring obedience. One might argue that Hermione's control stems from trauma. As a Muggle-born witch, she is constantly aware of her precarious position in the wizarding world. Her relentless pursuit of perfection, her obsession with rules, and her need to organize could be coping mechanisms born of fear. She doesn't fit in easily. She is mocked by Draco Malfoy and others who see her blood status as a stain. Perhaps in crafting order out of chaos she finds security, but this doesn't excuse the pattern, it only explains it. Number 18, inflexibility and lack of compromise. Of all the traits that defined Hermione Granger, her intelligence and moral compass were always at the forefront. She was fiercely loyal, admirably brave, and intellectually unmatched in her year at Hogwarts. But behind the brilliance and courage was a deep-rooted flaw that often made her difficult to deal with, even for her closest friends. Hermione had an unshakable sense of certainty in her own opinions. She clung to her ideas with such fervor that compromise became almost impossible. This inflexibility often led her into emotional dead ends, especially in moments where empathy or understanding would have built stronger bridges. It was not that Hermione lacked compassion, it was that she struggled to recognize validity in perspectives that contradicted her own, even slightly. The Triwizard Tournament in Harry's 4th year was a critical turning point for the trio, revealing their individual weaknesses under pressure. Hermione, who had always positioned herself as the glue between Harry and Ron, began to drift into emotionally complicated territory. Her inability to bend in arguments, particularly with Ron, reached its most visible height during the fallout after the Yule Ball. What could have been a moment of mutual growth turned instead into an emotional explosion, sparked not by malice but by pride and stubbornness. Hermione had hoped Ron would ask her to the Yule Ball, and it is heavily implied she waited for him to do so. When he didn't, she accepted an invitation from Victor Krum, Durmstrang's champion and a world-famous Quidditch star. To some, this looked like a stroke of luck, but for Hermione it was an emotionally loaded decision. She didn't go to the ball just to be seen, she went to make a point. She was tired of being overlooked, tired of being the brain of the group and nothing more. Her attendance with Victor was a message, particularly to Ron. Ron's reaction was predictably immature. When he finally realized that Hermione had gone with Victor, he exploded with jealousy. He accused her of fraternizing with the enemy, an irrational jab that had little to do with Hogwarts' rivalry with Durmstrang and everything to do with his feelings for her. But instead of diffusing the tension, instead of attempting a dialogue to understand Ron's insecurities, Hermione responded with fury. "Next time there's a ball, ask me before someone else does, and not as a last resort," she shouted, her voice shaking not just with anger but with heartbreak. The emotional context was rich, yet instead of finding common ground, she escalated the moment, ensuring that no truce could follow. The scene laid bare Hermione's deep-rooted difficulty in negotiating emotionally charged situations. Her black-and-white thinking, which served her so well in academics, was a barrier in relationships. She interpreted Ron's hesitation as a slight, rather than recognizing that his own feelings were tangled in confusion and fear of rejection. Her response wasn't unjustified, but it was uncompromising, and it left little room for understanding or growth. In Goblet of Fire, this pattern surfaces repeatedly. When Harry's name is drawn from the goblet, Hermione is the only one who believes him outright. While this is admirable, it also underscores her rigid tendency to take sides and stick to them. Her support is unwavering, but not always diplomatic. She doesn't attempt to help Ron see reason or understand why he feels betrayed by Harry. She simply positions herself on one side of the rift and treats the opposing view as illogical, unworthy of discussion. It's not just Ron who finds himself up against Hermione's inflexibility. In Prisoner of Azkaban, when Harry and Ron persist in believing that Crookshanks has eaten Scabbers, Hermione refuses to entertain the idea. "You don't know all the facts," she says, stiffly. Even as the situation escalates, she won't concede an inch. It's not until Scabbers is revealed to be Peter Pettigrew that the issue resolves itself, but the emotional damage lingers. Her unwillingness to consider that she might be wrong, even hypothetically, strained her relationships unnecessarily. This trait doesn't make Hermione a bad person. In fact, her convictions often drive her to fight for what's right, even when it's unpopular. Her campaign for the rights of House Elves, SPEW, is one such example. But even here, her approach lacks nuance. She doesn't stop to ask the House Elves what they want. She assumes that her interpretation of justice must be universal, that freedom as she defines it must be embraced by all. When Dobby becomes the only elf who appreciates her efforts, she fails to reconsider her methods or messaging. In Order of the Phoenix, when Harry begins seeing visions through Voldemort's eyes, Hermione is quick to dismiss his interpretation of what they mean. She warns him not to place too much trust in what he sees, fearing manipulation. While her caution is rooted in concern, she doesn't fully respect Harry's instincts. Her tone often implies that logic should always triumph over feeling, a dangerous assumption in a magical world where emotion often channels power. Her inability to trust perspectives that don't align with her own logic sometimes blinds her to important truths. Even her conflict with Professor Trelawney shows this inflexible streak. Hermione openly scoffs at divination, refusing to engage with it beyond the most superficial level. She doesn't believe in the subject, and so she deems it worthless. When Professor Trelawney makes vague predictions, Hermione doesn't just doubt her, she mocks her. Eventually, she storms out of class, not because she's frustrated with the material, but because she sees no value in it at all. While many might agree with her disdain, her absolute dismissal shows a lack of intellectual humility. During the Horcrux hunt in Deathly Hallows, Hermione's rigidity becomes both a strength and a source of conflict. She's the one who ensures they are well prepared, the one who keeps them hidden, fed, and protected. But she is also the one who clings most fiercely to Dumbledore's plan, even when it leads to stagnation and frustration. She resists Harry's instincts, questions his leaps of logic, and demands evidence before action. When Ron eventually leaves the group, part of the reason is his emotional fatigue, but another part is Hermione's insistence that things must be done by the book, even when the book offers no answers. When Ron returns, humbled and changed, Hermione nearly refuses to take him back. Her pain is real and her anger justified, but her reaction borders on punitive. It's Harry who diffuses the situation with humor, breaking the tension. Hermione's need for control often prevents her from embracing the messy, unpredictable nature of friendship and forgiveness. Her emotions are intense, but so is her belief that others must suffer consequences before they are forgiven. This flaw extends even into her adult life. In The Cursed Child, we see a version of Hermione who has risen to become Minister for Magic. She is brilliant and respected, but still sometimes unable to adapt when events deviate from her expectations. When Albus Potter and Scorpius Malfoy begin meddling with time, Hermione responds with authority and suspicion. Her first instinct is control, not curiosity. Her leadership is not in question, but the way she handles chaos still reflects that inner rigidity. None of this is to say Hermione is incapable of growth. On the contrary, her arc across the series is one of maturity and increasing self-awareness. By the time the trio faces their final battle at Hogwarts, she has learned to temper her instincts with compassion. Her goodbye with Ron before the Battle of Hogwarts is tender and real. She kisses him, not as a strategy, not out of obligation, but out of a deep emotional truth that had been long buried beneath layers of logic and pride. Hermione's greatest strength was always her mind, but the mind can be a prison when it refuses to accept other forms of truth. Her story is, in part, about learning to listen to others, to feelings, to the world as it is, not just as it should be. She was never evil, never unkind for cruelty's sake. But her inability to compromise made her more human, and that humanity, flawed and brilliant, is what makes her such a memorable and powerful character. In every friendship there are moments when listening matters more than speaking. Hermione often failed in this regard. Her voice was loud, her convictions louder still. She could drown out disagreement with facts and rules, rarely pausing to ask what the other person needed to feel heard. But even in her worst moments, she wasn't malicious. Her rigidity came from a place of fear of being wrong, of losing control, of not being enough. Looking back, one can't help but wonder what would have happened if she had handled the Yule Ball fallout differently. What if she had said, "I know you're upset, I was too"? What if she had allowed Ron's jealousy to be seen not as an insult, but as a clumsy expression of care? Perhaps they would have come closer sooner. But then again, perhaps Hermione needed to stumble through these moments to grow. After all, growth rarely comes from being right. It comes from being willing to admit you were wrong. So much of what makes Hermione admirable also makes her frustrating. She fights for what she believes in, but sometimes forgets that others believe just as strongly in different truths. Her story is a cautionary tale about the limits of certainty. It reminds us that intelligence without empathy can lead to loneliness, and that the bravest thing a person can do is sometimes to say, "I might be wrong." Hermione Granger will always be remembered as the brightest witch of her age, but even the brightest flame casts shadows. In those shadows lived a young woman who, for all her wisdom, had to learn, slowly, painfully, that sometimes the truth lies not in victory but in compromise. And it is in those moments of surrender, when she let go of being right and chose instead to be present, that Hermione's character became truly extraordinary. Number 19. Subtle arrogance toward Muggles. Hermione Granger, the brilliant Muggle-born witch whose intellect and diligence became legendary at Hogwarts, often stood as a symbol of pride for those outside the traditional wizarding bloodlines. Her origins were a badge of honor, and she wore them with defiance in the face of pure-blood prejudice. Yet behind the shield of this noble pride there flickered now and then a glimmer of something less endearing, an unintentional yet tangible sense of superiority, not only over pure-blood elitists like Draco Malfoy, but more troublingly over her own friends and peers who lacked her Muggle knowledge or academic diligence. It was a contradiction rarely explored but quietly present in the narrative, weaving itself into interactions that left her companions often feeling belittled and diminished. The first-year train ride to Hogwarts was the audience's introduction to Hermione's intellect and her tone. When she corrected Ron on the incantation for the levitation charm, it was not simply a matter of being right. It was the manner in which she corrected him, with a certain condescension that would become familiar. "It's Leviosa, not Leviosa," she said, drawing out the syllables with a precision that was less about instruction and more about performance. While Ron's reaction, embarrassed and defensive, was expected, what went unnoticed was the origin of this sharpness. A girl who, armed with knowledge in a world new to her, quickly learned that superiority could be a shield. Hermione's relationship with Ron became the most telling ground for this subtle arrogance. Unlike Harry, who often observed before reacting, Ron was impulsive, emotional, and decidedly less academic. Coming from a wizarding family, his understanding of Muggles was minimal, but instead of being met with patience or curiosity, Ron's ignorance was at times weaponized in Hermione's hands. In their third year, when discussing the subject of electricity, Ron's confusion about Muggle inventions was met not with a patient explanation, but with a smug, "Honestly, don't you read?" It wasn't a question, it was a judgment. She took pride in her Muggle heritage, but it was a pride that often danced too close to vanity. In Order of the Phoenix, during a heated conversation about the Ministry's methods, Hermione referred to how the wizarding world was miles behind Muggle society in terms of governance, education, and communication. Her critique wasn't wrong. Wizarding methods were often outdated and absurd, but her delivery alienated those around her. She did not offer these observations to inspire reform or understanding, but rather as statements of superiority, as if to say, "See how much more advanced my world is." One particularly jarring moment came when the trio was discussing the absurdity of wizarding bureaucracy. Hermione compared the Daily Prophet to Muggle tabloids, brushing off the confusion of her friends who, unlike her, didn't have a reference point for the Daily Mail or the Sun. Instead of explaining, she sighed, rolled her eyes and moved on, leaving Harry and Ron in awkward silence. These weren't acts of malice, but they were marks of someone so used to being right that she forgot the sting of being made to feel small. Even her cause for the rights of house elves, as noble as it was, became a reflection of this hidden arrogance. In Goblet of Fire, she formed SPW and began knitting hats and socks, determined to liberate house elves without ever truly listening to them. Dobby was grateful, yes, but most elves found her efforts offensive. Winky cried at the mere suggestion of freedom. Rather than re-evaluate her approach, Hermione insisted they were brainwashed. It never occurred to her that her interpretation of injustice, drawn from a Muggle sense of social activism, might not neatly fit the complexities of a different magical culture. Her certainty, her unshakable belief that she knew better, was not humility but hubris. This pattern extended into the classroom. In Prisoner of Azkaban, when Professor Trelawney spoke of divination, Hermione dismissed the entire subject as woolly, scoffing at her classmates who took interest. She walked out mid-lesson convinced that the discipline lacked merit. While Trelawney may have been eccentric and prone to theatrics, Hermione's rejection was less about scientific skepticism and more about the assumption that anything she didn't value was therefore foolish. It was a familiar dynamic. Knowledge was her domain, and deviation from it meant folly. Her interactions with Luna Lovegood further exemplified this behavior. Luna, with her dreamy voice and belief in the improbable, was everything Hermione was not. The tension between them was palpable. In Order of the Phoenix, when Luna spoke of creatures like the crumple-horned snorkack, Hermione didn't just doubt her, she ridiculed her. "There's no such thing as a crumple-horned snorkack," she said flatly, ignoring that the conversation wasn't about fact, but belief. Her tone dismissed not just the content, but Luna herself. It wasn't enough to be right. Others had to be wrong, and publicly so. Hermione's rigid sense of correctness extended into her interpretation of rules. While Ron and Harry broke them often, Hermione's allegiance to structure was unwavering, until it suited her otherwise. Her hypocrisy was visible when she used a time-turner to attend more classes than humanly possible, yet harshly criticized others for cheating or seeking shortcuts. Her moral compass was based not on principles, but on her own standards. It wasn't that she thought rules were sacred, it was that she believed she knew which rules truly mattered. In Half-Blood Prince, her disdain for the Mysterious Prince's textbook was immediate. She was appalled that Harry would trust someone else's annotations over the standard text. "You can't just take instructions from a book someone else has scribbled in," she exclaimed, but what she meant was, "You didn't get this knowledge the right way." Hermione's discomfort wasn't just about safety. It was about the challenge to her academic authority. Someone else had a better way, and that unsettled her. When Slughorn hosted gatherings for his Slug Club, Hermione's reaction was peculiar. Despite her qualifications, she wasn't invited until later. She feigned disinterest, suggesting the club was shallow and elitist. But when she finally received an invitation, she accepted eagerly. The pretense of humility gave way to the gratification of being seen. It was a moment that revealed much about Hermione's internal contradictions. She longed for recognition, but disdained those who received it more easily than she did. In the realm of friendships, her behavior often oscillated between care and condescension. When Ron was made a prefect in Order of the Phoenix, Hermione's surprise was barely concealed. "That's great, Ron," she said, but her tone betrayed disbelief. It was as if she had never imagined Ron as someone worthy of such responsibility. Her support was genuine, but layered with a quiet presumption that she, the ever-diligent student, had been the obvious choice. Her tendency to correct others, often publicly, was relentless. In Deathly Hallows, during their camping fugitive days, she chastised Ron for mispronouncing Parseltongue. Though they were in crisis, Hermione couldn't resist reminding him that he was getting it wrong. These weren't moments of helpful guidance. They were reflections of someone who needed control, especially when everything else was in chaos. Her knowledge was her anchor, and she wielded it not just for survival, but for dominance. The condescension extended to Harry too, though less frequently. In Order of the Phoenix, when he insisted that Voldemort had returned, Hermione struggled to believe him, clinging instead to logic and facts. Her doubt wasn't rooted in concern, it was skepticism born of someone who placed more faith in books than lived experience. Though she eventually supported him, the delay caused pain. Harry needed belief, not footnotes. What makes Hermione's arrogance so complex is that it was rarely malicious. It came from a place of insecurity, of needing to prove herself in a world that constantly reminded her she didn't belong. Her perfectionism was armor, and her knowledge was her sword. But in wielding it, she sometimes cut those closest to her. She never apologized for this. Not once in the books did Hermione reflect on whether her corrections were hurtful, or if her superiority made others feel small. Perhaps the most telling aspect of her personality was how rarely she allowed herself to be vulnerable. Hermione seldom admitted when she was wrong. In Deathly Hallows, when she doubted Xenophilius Lovegood and the truth of the Deathly Hallows, she was not only proven wrong, but deeply shaken. Yet she moved past it with little reflection. Her worldview had been challenged, but there was no moment of humility, only silence and recalibration. Even her interactions with her parents were shrouded in detachment. In Deathly Hallows, she erased their memories to protect them. It was an act of love, yes, but also of control. She decided what was best for them without discussion. She believed she knew better, even if it meant rewriting their lives. There was no mention of their will in the matter, no questioning of whether they might have chosen differently. It was another example of Hermione's belief that her way was the only way. In the end, Hermione Granger remains a beloved character, not in spite of her flaws, but because of them. Her subtle arrogance, especially toward muggles and the uninformed, is not a stain on her character, but a dimension of it. She was human, imperfect, and brilliant. Her journey wasn't just about learning spells or defeating evil. It was about learning that wisdom requires more than intelligence. It requires empathy. And that the smartest person in the room isn't the one who knows the most, but the one who makes others feel they matter, too. Number 20. Tendency to manipulate. Of all the beloved characters in the Harry Potter series, Hermione Granger stands out as the brilliant mind of the trio, logical, fiercely loyal, and a tireless seeker of justice. Yet beneath her bushy hair and brilliant mind lies a far more complex persona than fans often acknowledge. Hermione was not just clever or rule-abiding, she was capable of subtle manipulation when the stakes were high. At times, she crossed lines others wouldn't dare approach, and she did so wrapped in the comforting cloak of righteousness. A striking example of this darker aspect of her character unfolded during the creation of Dumbledore's Army, a secret student organization she co-founded to oppose the Ministry's refusal to properly educate Hogwarts students in defense against the dark arts. When Dolores Umbridge imposed her tyrannical rule over Hogwarts, banning all practical defense instruction, Hermione was among the first to act. She persuaded Harry to teach students how to defend themselves, a noble cause, no doubt. But her method of organizing and securing the group reveals something more nuanced than just a desire to do good. Instead of simply asking for confidentiality or ensuring that everyone understood the importance of secrecy, Hermione cast a jinx on the list of names that each member signed. Anyone who betrayed the group would suffer a terrible fate. Their face would break out in painful, disfiguring boils, spelling out the word sneak across their forehead. Marietta Edgecombe, a Ravenclaw student and friend of Cho Chang, would learn this the hard way. What makes this decision especially revealing is not just the act itself, but the way Hermione implemented it. She did not explain the consequences to the group beforehand. She didn't warn them or give them a chance to opt out. She cast the spell in secret, concealed the danger, and allowed her classmates to walk unknowingly into a trap. It was only after Marietta betrayed the DA to Umbridge that the curse manifested, painful, humiliating, and irreversible for quite some time. In Order of the Phoenix, this moment is brushed over with a tinge of humor, even satisfaction. But what Hermione did was deeply manipulative. She took control, denied others their agency, and exacted a punishment not sanctioned by any authority but her own. This wasn't a case of harmless trickery. This was magical assault disguised as a clever precaution. In doing so, Hermione assumed the role of judge and executioner, deciding in advance what punishment was suitable and ensuring it would be meted out automatically. She even expressed no regret for it afterward, defending her actions on the basis of necessity. "You deserve it," she said to Marietta, according to Harry's internal recollection. The implication was clear. Hermione believed that betrayal deserved pain and humiliation, and she acted to ensure it would happen. This isn't the behavior of someone who merely values order. It's the behavior of someone who believes she knows best, even when that means crossing ethical lines. Her manipulation didn't stop at curses and secrecy. Throughout her years at Hogwarts, Hermione consistently used her intelligence not just to solve problems, but to steer others toward the outcomes she desired. Take, for example, her use of the time turner in Prisoner of Azkaban. While the device was officially sanctioned and used primarily for academic reasons, she was quick to apply it to more dangerous situations. When she and Harry saved Buckbeak and Sirius Black, their motivations were undeniably noble, but their method involved deception, secrecy, and rewriting events. While Dumbledore gave them a cryptic blessing, it was Hermione who understood the consequences and drove the plan forward. She calculated each move with precision, keeping full control over the timeline and leaving Harry once again to follow her lead. This pattern of control, of shaping reality to match her ideals, becomes even more apparent in her treatment of others' decisions. Ron and Harry, despite their bravery, were often manipulated by Hermione under the pretense of logic or concern. She nudged, pushed, and occasionally guilt-tripped them into the right decisions. Her motives were rarely malicious, but her techniques often bypassed open discussion. She didn't always persuade. Sometimes she cornered. For example, when she blackmailed Rita Skeeter by imprisoning her in a magically sealed jar during Goblet of Fire, she didn't just stop the reporter from spreading lies, she gagged her entirely. There was no appeal, no formal complaint, no legal process. Hermione simply took control and held Rita hostage for weeks. This wasn't an isolated moment of impulsive vengeance. It was carefully calculated, executed in secret, and maintained with constant vigilance. Rita Skeeter, as unpleasant as she was, still had rights, even in the wizarding world. But to Hermione, those rights didn't matter if the target was guilty in her eyes. Again, the pattern is clear. When Hermione saw someone threatening her vision of justice, she didn't hesitate to use underhanded means. She justified it to herself and to others by arguing that it was for the greater good. But that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. Her actions weren't born from malice, they were born from certainty. Certainty in Hermione's world was a powerful weapon. She believed in facts, in right and wrong, and in the importance of making people see reason. But when reason failed, she wasn't above using manipulation or force. In Deathly Hallows, as the trio prepared for their journey across England to find and destroy Horcruxes, Hermione was the one who planned every detail. She packed the enchanted handbag, stocked with supplies, spellbooks, and a tent. She made the decisions about where they would go, what they would carry, and how they would hide. She even altered her own parents' memories to protect them, erasing their knowledge of her existence entirely and sending them to live in Australia. That choice, while made out of love, was one of the most extreme acts of manipulation in the series. Hermione didn't just say goodbye to her parents. She removed their identities, changed their lives, and gave them no say in the matter. She played God with their minds, ensuring they would forget their only daughter. The morality of that act is haunting. She didn't consult them. She didn't trust them with the truth. She acted unilaterally, believing she knew what was best. Even if we grant her noble intentions, the method reveals once more that Hermione would use any means, including erasure of memory and identity, to achieve her version of safety. Another example lies in her dealings with the House Elves. Though she founded SPW to liberate them, she did so in a way that ignored their cultural views and individual voices. She insisted on their liberation, knitting clothes and hiding them in places where elves might stumble upon them and accidentally be freed. This approach, while meant to be kind, disregarded the elves' perspective entirely. They didn't want freedom, at least not in the way she defined it. Dobby was a rare exception, not the rule. Hermione couldn't accept that their desires differed from hers. She believed she knew better and sought to free them without consent. Even her friends avoided discussing SPEW, recognizing that Hermione's crusade was more about her vision of justice than the elves' actual needs. Her manipulation often wore a mask of logic, cloaked in phrases like common sense or it's for your own good. But control is control, even when disguised as kindness. In her 5th year, when she needed to keep the DA members in line, she didn't trust them to make responsible decisions. She punished potential betrayal in advance. That isn't just foresight, that's a presumption of guilt, a belief that others cannot be trusted and must be bound by fear. In her world, fear of consequences was just another tool for order. We see it again when she tricks Umbridge into entering the Forbidden Forest. While many fans cheered at the moment, calling it well-deserved, the fact remains Hermione deliberately manipulated Umbridge into danger. She lied, provoked, and led the woman into a situation where she would be at the mercy of centaurs, creatures she knew were proud, territorial, and could be violent. Hermione used the centaurs as a weapon, knowing their behavior and exploiting it to remove an obstacle. The ends, for her, justified the means. She didn't seek a duel or confrontation, she engineered a trap. Even in moments of friendship, Hermione's influence was often the dominant force. She dictated study schedules, chided Ron and Harry for poor academic habits, and decided which rules could be bent or broken. When the trio used Polyjuice Potion in their 2nd year to investigate Draco Malfoy, it was Hermione who brewed it, organized the plan, and moved the boys into action. They were hesitant, but she pushed forward, confident that her logic outweighed their doubts. And time after time, it was her will that prevailed. When we examine her character without the rose-colored lens of heroism, we find not a villain, but a deeply complex figure. Hermione Granger was a force of intelligence, morality, and fierce determination. But she was also a master manipulator, someone who wielded power with conviction and subtlety. She didn't seek control for its own sake, but she claimed it without hesitation when she believed it necessary. And in the end, that is what makes her so compelling. Not her perfection, but her flaws, her belief that she always knew best, even when the path was darker than she'd admit. To see Hermione only as the voice of reason or the heart of the trio is to miss the sharpness of her edge. She used magic not only to heal or defend, but to dominate and coerce. She used knowledge as a weapon and trust as a tool. She was the architect of strategies that crossed moral boundaries, and she stood by her choices. The curse on Marietta, the manipulation of Umbridge, the memory spell on her parents. These were not accidents. They were decisions cold and calculated, and they tell us something vital about Hermione. She was willing to go farther than anyone else if she believed it was right. This willingness to manipulate, to orchestrate events from behind the scenes makes Hermione one of the most fascinating characters in the wizarding world. She lived by reason, but ruled by control. She inspired others, but led them quietly through clever design. And while Harry was the chosen one and Ron the loyal friend, Hermione was the strategist, the one who ensured that the battle could even take place. Her hands were not always clean, but they were steady, and in the chaos of war and magic that made all the difference. Number 21 acts from fear, not courage. Hermione Granger, despite her sorting into Gryffindor, was never the traditional image of a Lionheart. Her brilliance was unquestionable, her loyalty unwavering, but beneath her intelligence and her fierce dedication to rules lay a heart often clenched by fear. It was not cowardice, but rather an overwhelming need for control and safety. Her actions, especially in the earlier years at Hogwarts, frequently stemmed not from boldness but from fear. Fear of failure, fear of danger, and fear of the unknown. When Harry Potter received his mysterious firebolt during their 3rd year, Hermione's reaction wasn't celebration or envy, it was suspicion. The broom had no note, no explanation, and came during a time when the school was under threat from Sirius Black, the infamous escaped convict. While Ron and Harry were enthralled by the high-quality broomstick, Hermione quietly reported the gift to Professor McGonagall. This was not a decision born from courage, but a calculated reaction driven by fear. She feared for Harry's safety, feared that the broom was jinxed. Her logical instincts took precedence, but they were fueled by a deep-seated anxiety rather than bold Gryffindor daring. Her decision created a rift between her and her 2 best friends, a painful emotional cost that she accepted with quiet guilt. It wasn't the first time Hermione chose fear over camaraderie. In truth, she rarely plunged into danger with the reckless abandon Gryffindor celebrated. When Harry made plans to sneak into Hogsmeade using his marauder's map and invisibility cloak, Hermione's immediate reaction was to protest, not because the plan lacked merit, but because it was unauthorized and dangerous. Her loyalty to the rules of the institution, to the boundaries that created order in a chaotic magical world, overpowered her trust in Harry's instincts. Her objection to Harry's Hogsmeade trip is a clear instance where caution overruled intuition. "Harry, I'm really, really sorry, but unless you get permission," she began, trying to reason with him. But she knew Harry wouldn't listen. The way she tried to dissuade him wasn't rooted in concern for legality, but in concern for what might happen. Sirius Black was rumored to be hunting Harry, and for Hermione, even the faintest probability of danger was unacceptable. It wasn't a matter of right or wrong, it was the uncertainty she could not stomach. Hermione's fear also revealed itself in the Philosopher's Stone quest during their 1st year. Though she accompanied Harry and Ron through the trapdoor and helped them bypass the challenges guarding the stone, she often hesitated more than the others. In the Devil's Snare Room, for instance, Hermione momentarily panicked, forgetting that she could conjure light to weaken the plant. Her fear of getting it wrong clouded her quick thinking, something uncharacteristic for her. Ron had to yell at her to stop moving before she snapped back to clarity. The hesitation wasn't due to lack of knowledge, but a paralysis born from being unsure in the face of real danger. This tendency became even clearer in their 2nd year during the events surrounding the Chamber of Secrets. While Harry pursued the mystery of the heir of Slytherin and the attacks, Hermione devoted herself to research, working frantically to uncover the nature of the monster without directly investigating the physical clues Harry was following. Her approach was intellectual, safe, and removed, and when she was petrified by the basilisk, it was because she was out alone, carrying a mirror to avoid looking directly at the creature. Even in her moment of bravery, Hermione was acting through a framework of caution and preparation, armor made of books and logic rather than boldness. Fear of expulsion and breaking rules also guided her decisions more than Gryffindor spontaneity. When Harry and Ron saved her from the troll on Halloween, Hermione had initially lied to Professor McGonagall, claiming she went looking for the troll herself. It was a selfless act to protect her friends, yes, but also a recognition that her original fear, being out after hours, had put her in that situation in the first place. That night, her fear and her rule-following had nearly cost her life, and only the intervention of her reckless peers saved her. Later, during their 4th year, when Harry was unexpectedly entered into the Triwizard Tournament, Hermione supported him publicly, but behind the scenes she constantly worried for his safety. She chided him for not preparing enough, insisted he learn proper spells, and was deeply uncomfortable when he leaned too heavily on luck or hunches. Her involvement in helping him through the tasks, especially the underwater challenge, where she helped him learn the bubblehead charm, was meticulous and rooted in her desire to eliminate as much unpredictability as possible. Her fear manifested in over-preparation, in obsessing over worst-case scenarios, in an attempt to control chaos. Even in the creation of Dumbledore's army in her 5th year, Hermione's motivations were not purely driven by a sense of rebellion. When she proposed the idea, it wasn't because she wanted to defy authority for the sake of justice, but because she feared what would happen if the students remained unprepared. The presence of Dolores Umbridge, the Ministry's interference, the looming shadow of Voldemort, all these were catalysts of dread. Hermione, always a strategist, wanted to arm herself and her friends with knowledge, not because it was thrilling, but because ignorance, in her eyes, was a more dangerous enemy than any dark wizard. Her dynamic with Harry often reflected this divide. He was impulsive, emotionally driven, led by gut feelings and visions. Hermione, in contrast, anchored him with caution. She was the voice in his ear telling him to wait, to think, to reconsider. When he believed that Sirius was being tortured in the Department of Mysteries, she questioned the vision. She urged him to be rational, to suspect a trap. Her fears were valid, it was a trap, but the way she approached the situation again highlighted her dependence on logic over emotion, caution over action. Her fear wasn't just about danger, it extended to social disapproval and failure. During the Yule Ball, her decision to attend with Victor Crumb was a rare moment of spontaneity, but even that decision was cloaked in apprehension. She kept it secret, fearing ridicule or misunderstanding from her peers, especially Ron. And when the inevitable confrontation came, she reacted with uncharacteristic emotion, not out of bravery, but because the fragile confidence she had built was shattered by judgment. In the final book, Hermione's fear reached a crescendo when they went on the run. She was the most prepared, packing the enchanted handbag with books, supplies, and essentials. Her foresight saved them more than once, but it was also a manifestation of her terror of being caught unprepared. When they were attacked at the cafe after leaving the wedding, Hermione was the one who cast the protective spells, the one who modified the Death Eater's memories, but her hands shook afterward. Her magic was powerful, but it was powered by necessity, not thrill. Every move she made was precise, planned, and drenched in the anxiety of what might go wrong. Her insistence on using Polyjuice Potion to infiltrate the Ministry of Magic also spoke volumes. She had memorized every detail about Mafalda Hopkirk. She practiced her walk, her voice, her habits. She studied like it was an exam. For Hermione, bravery was preparation, fear camouflaged as perfectionism. She wasn't rushing into danger with a sword raised. She was walking in with a clipboard and a plan, praying it would be enough to survive, yet her fear did not paralyze her. That is where Hermione's strength lies. Though her actions were often guided by apprehension, she still acted. She still followed Harry into the unknown. She still endured torture at the hands of Bellatrix Lestrange. That moment in Malfoy Manor, when she was carved with a knife, screaming as Ron and Harry listened from below, was the ultimate test. She did not betray her friends, she endured. And in that moment her fear burned away, replaced by something else, unshakable loyalty and a quiet, painful courage. Still, that courage was often reactive. She rose when needed, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. The distinction is subtle but telling. A true Gryffindor, by traditional standards, leaps before they look. Hermione always looked first, calculated the fall, and only then made the jump if she deemed the risk acceptable. Even her use of the time turner in her 3rd year speaks to this pattern. It wasn't used for adventure, but to attend more classes. The very idea of overloading her schedule was motivated by a fear of inadequacy, of missing out on knowledge. When she later used it to save Buckbeak and Sirius, the act was indeed heroic, but she did it with trembling nerves and clenched fists. It was Dumbledore who suggested the idea. Hermione followed through, but the decision wasn't hers alone. She had guidance, reassurance, structure. In the Battle of Hogwarts, Hermione fought bravely, but always with a plan. She didn't charge blindly into battle, she moved in calculated steps. She helped destroy a Horcrux with Ron, and together they set the Basilisk Fang into Hufflepuff's cup. Yet even then her face was pale, her breathing shallow. Courage was present, yes, but so was fear. They danced together in every decision she made. Ultimately, Hermione Granger was brave, but not in the way Gryffindors are typically imagined. Her bravery was meticulous, thoughtful, and often born from fear. She feared for her friends, for justice, for the world she loved. She feared failure more than death, but she never let that fear silence her, even if it sometimes held her back. Her story is not one of bold leaps, but of calculated steps taken despite the fear screaming inside. That is perhaps the truest form of courage, the one that walks hand in hand with fear, not in its absence. Hermione was never fearless, but she acted anyway, and that is what made her extraordinary. Number 22, emotionally closed off. Of all the characters that roamed the ancient halls of Hogwarts, Hermione Granger was perhaps the most disciplined in mind, and, paradoxically, the most guarded in heart. She wielded her intelligence like a wand, sharp, precise, reliable. Yet beneath the steady hand that turned pages and the calm voice that recited incantations was a storm of emotions she often refused to acknowledge, even to herself. Emotional vulnerability for her was not a currency she traded in easily. Her world was built upon knowledge and logic. Anything outside of that realm was either inconvenient or outright threatening. But as the years passed and the trials of adolescence took their toll, that emotional suppression began to show cracks, and from those cracks poured pain, jealousy, and the desperate need to be seen not just as clever, but as human. Hermione's emotional closedness was not the result of coldness, it was a defense mechanism. She had entered a world where she had to constantly prove herself. Born to Muggle parents, she knew she did not have the inherited comfort of wizarding lineage to fall back on. Her solution was to excel, to become so indispensable that no one could question her place. But while her mind sharpened, her heart remained shielded. She rarely spoke of her insecurities. She did not confide in her friends about the crushing pressure she placed upon herself. Instead, she buried her emotions beneath layers of determination, allowing only brief glimpses when the weight became too much. This pattern manifested most vividly in her complex relationship with Ron Weasley. Their dynamic was rich with unspoken tension, forged through years of shared danger, laughter, and companionship. But Hermione's feelings for Ron, which simmered quietly in the background, were never expressed directly. She bristled when he paid attention to other girls, yet she refused to confront her emotions openly. One of the most revealing moments of this emotional bottling occurred during their 6th year, when Ron began dating Lavender Brown. While Harry and the readers could clearly sense her distress, Hermione did not admit it, not to Harry, not to Ron, and not even to herself. Instead of voicing her pain, Hermione channeled her emotional turmoil into anger and sarcasm. She mocked Ron's behavior with biting remarks, feigned indifference, and threw herself even deeper into her studies. But the more she tried to suppress her feelings, the more volatile they became. Eventually, they erupted during a scene in the Gryffindor common room when Hermione conjured a flock of enchanted birds and sent them flying at Ron after discovering him in an intimate moment with Lavender. This was not merely a burst of magic, it was the physical manifestation of months of internalized jealousy, hurt, and heartbreak. The text reads, "Hermione raised her wand and muttered something. A great flock of birds burst from the end of it and swooped down upon Ron, pecking and clawing at every bit of flesh they could reach." It was as though her silence had become unbearable and needed to scream through action. This moment was not just dramatic for its visual effect, but because it represented the first time Hermione's true feelings broke the surface in an undeniable way. And yet even then she did not speak of love. She did not confess. She did not explain. She simply left the room, her pride and pain both wounded. The emotional fallout lingered in the air long after the birds had vanished. It was Ron, not Hermione, who eventually confronted the nature of their bond. Hermione remained a fortress, waiting for someone else to scale her walls. Throughout the series, Harry and Ron showed a more instinctive ease in sharing their emotions. Harry, for all his brooding, was not afraid to express his fears and vulnerabilities. He spoke to Dumbledore, to Sirius, to Ron. Ron, in turn, voiced his jealousy, his frustration, even his inadequacies. But Hermione? She rarely let herself be seen in that way. Her cries were silent, her heartbreak hidden behind books and perfect exam scores. This made her seem emotionally distant, even aloof, though she was anything but. Her passion burned as fiercely as any Gryffindor's, but she chose to contain it, fearing it would consume her. Take, for instance, the night she erased her parents' memories during the Second Wizarding War. It was a devastating act of love, one that tore her world apart. And yet she never spoke of it afterward. There was no scene where she confided in her friends, no tears shared, no moment of emotional reckoning. It is only through a fleeting remark that we even learn of it. I've also modified my parents' memories so that they're convinced they're really called Wendell and Monica Wilkins, and that their life's ambition is to move to Australia. The simplicity of her words belied the depth of the sacrifice. She bore it alone because that was how she had always learned to carry her pain. Even her activism, such as her efforts to liberate house elves, carried undertones of her own emotional isolation. She championed causes not just out of righteousness, but perhaps as a way to channel her own sense of alienation and longing for justice, both external and internal. When no one supported SPEW, she did not lash out or express hurt. She persisted, undeterred, but clearly disappointed. She never admitted how much it wounded her that even her closest friends dismissed her passions. Again, her feelings were tightly folded away, never shared. Hermione's moments of emotional exposure were often involuntary. She cried in the girls' bathroom after Ron's cruel remark about her not having friends in the Philosopher's Stone, but even then it was only Harry and Ron's intervention with the troll that brought them together. She did not seek comfort, she did not complain, she simply disappeared into solitude. It was a pattern that repeated itself. Her heart cried silently, and only circumstance forced it to be heard. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, when she took on a grueling schedule using a time-turner to attend multiple classes simultaneously, her mental and physical exhaustion reached dangerous levels. She snapped at Ron, walked out on Hagrid's case, and slapped Draco Malfoy. But what no one saw was the toll it was taking on her spirit. Her pursuit of perfection was a form of punishment. And yet, she never allowed herself to say, "I'm overwhelmed." She did not ask for help. She only broke down when she had passed her own limits, when her emotional dam could no longer hold. Even in moments of joy, Hermione kept her emotional cards close to her chest. When she danced with Victor Crumb at the Yule Ball, she basked in the admiration, but could not fully express how much it meant to her to be seen not just as the brainy girl in the background, but as someone worthy of desire. Her happiness was tempered by anxiety. How would Ron react? Would he care? Should she care if he didn't? These were questions she asked only herself. To everyone else, she wore a composed face, a practiced calm. Her ability to suppress emotion made her a formidable witch, but it also isolated her. During the Horcrux hunt, tensions between the trio soared, and while Ron stormed off and Harry brooded by the tent, Hermione often sat in silence, lost in books, tears slipping down only when she believed no one was watching. Her loyalty was unwavering, but it came at the cost of immense emotional solitude. Her relationship with Harry was deep, yet she never truly opened up to him either. Their connection was built on mutual respect and shared trials, but not emotional transparency. In the Order of the Phoenix, as Harry battled the trauma of Cedric's death and the weight of the prophecy, Hermione stood by him unfailingly. Yet she often defaulted to logic over empathy, offering strategies instead of solace. She wanted to help, but didn't know how to say, "I'm scared too." When Harry lashed out, she took it calmly, redirecting the conversation rather than expressing her own hurt. Her emotional stoicism was both her strength and her cage. Her sarcasm, too, became a defense mechanism. Sharp, biting, and often deployed when she felt vulnerable, it allowed her to mask insecurity with intellect. She wielded words like weapons, not to harm, but to distance, to keep others from asking too many questions, because if they did, they might see the cracks beneath. And Hermione, for all her brilliance, feared being seen in a way she couldn't control. Over time, Hermione did learn to open up, slowly, cautiously, and only to a select few. By the Deathly Hallows, her feelings for Ron were more difficult to hide. She stayed by his side during his injury, worried openly, and when they finally kissed during the Battle of Hogwarts, it was a culmination of years of suppressed emotion. But even that kiss was triggered not by a romantic gesture, but by the heat of war, the proximity of death. It took the collapse of their world for her heart to speak. The complexity of Hermione's emotional life makes her one of the most compelling characters in the series. She was not heartless, she was simply afraid to be vulnerable in a world that had taught her to always be the best, to never falter, to prove herself every single day. Her emotional closedness was not a flaw, it was a scar, one formed by the quiet battles she fought every day. And in those brief, rare moments when she let someone in, it became clear how deep her emotions truly ran. In the end, Hermione's greatest strength was not her intellect, but her capacity for love, a love so vast that she was willing to erase herself from her parents' memories, to walk into mortal danger for her friends, to endure silence, rejection, and pain without complaint. And while she may not have always known how to say "I'm hurt" or "I love you," she said it in every action, in every sacrifice, in every step she took beside those she cared for. Her silence spoke volumes, if only you knew how to listen. And perhaps that is the final truth about Hermione Granger. She did not need to speak to be understood, but it would have eased her burden had she ever believed she had the right to feel out loud. Number 23, no sense of humor. Among the many complexities that made Hermione Granger such a unique and brilliant character was her near imperviousness to humor. This particular trait, although often overshadowed by her intelligence, loyalty, and moral compass, played a subtle yet powerful role in how she interacted with those closest to her. Ron, Harry, Fred, George, and even others like Lee Jordan or Seamus Finnegan often found themselves in that invisible line between laughter and reprimand, when Hermione, with all her good intentions, just didn't find the joke funny, or worse, found it offensive. This difficulty wasn't rooted in malice or condescension. Rather, Hermione's relationship with humor reflected her earnestness, her need for control, and a deeply ingrained seriousness that made light-heartedness feel at times like a betrayal of responsibility. As early as their first year at Hogwarts, the trio's dynamics hinted at this divide. Ron and Harry often joked with one another, sometimes at Hermione's expense, though never cruelly. "It's Leviosa, not Leviosa," became the catchphrase of the term, but Hermione did not laugh. Instead, she cried in the girls' bathroom. When Fred and George Weasley tried to involve her in their playful antics, they were met not with giggles, but with lectures. To the twins, whose entire worldview thrived on humor as survival and rebellion, Hermione's reactions seemed like roadblocks. She wasn't simply unamused, she was fundamentally opposed to the principle of the joke. When they tested skiving snack boxes or bewitched their own badges during the Triwizard Tournament to say, "Support Cedric Diggory Potter stinks," Hermione viewed it as juvenile at best, harmful at worst. To Fred and George, such pranks were a way to fight back against unfairness. To Hermione, they were distractions from the real fight. The twins' legacy at Hogwarts culminating in their spectacular exit from Umbridge's regime, was marked by brilliance, chaos, and bold humour. And while students cheered and Peeves saluted them, Hermione's applause came only later, reserved and analytical, more impressed by their logistics than their comedy. Her view of humour was often utilitarian. She liked logic, purpose, and order. Humour, as it flowed from the Weasleys, was unpredictable, illogical, and designed to disrupt order. Harry, whose sense of humour evolved under the pressures of war and loss, found relief in sarcasm and irony. By Half-Blood Prince, his jabs at Slughorn or Snape grew darker, more biting. Hermione often didn't appreciate these remarks and sometimes chastised him. She once scolded Harry during their 6th year for calling Trelawney's predictions utter rubbish, reminding him of the potential truth behind the prophecy. But to Harry, the sarcasm was his armour. To Hermione, it was recklessness disguised as wit. Ron's humour was perhaps the most frequently misunderstood by her. He teased, joked, and used humour as a bridge between discomfort and affection. But Hermione rarely met him halfway. In Goblet of Fire, when Ron joked about Victor Crumb using a love potion on Hermione, she was furious. Ron's immaturity, masked in banter, collided with Hermione's craving for respect and seriousness. They often ended up arguing rather than laughing. This contrast didn't mean Hermione lacked a sense of humour altogether. It simply didn't align with those around her. She appreciated wit when it was clever, thoughtful, and perhaps a bit dry. She chuckled at Professor McGonagall's stern sarcasm or at Luna Lovegood's accidental deadpan. But slapstick, pranks, or mocking others never sat right with her. Fred and George's brand of comedy, bold, loud, and chaotic, was as far as one could get from Hermione's comfort zone. It wasn't only the twins. Lee Jordan's dramatic Quidditch commentary often earned her glares and, honestly, Lee, responses. Even during high-stakes moments when tension needed relief, Hermione rarely allowed herself that release. At Grimmauld Place, when the twins transformed their bedrooms or teased Percy, Hermione preferred to focus on cleaning the cursed drawing room or organising the library. Her seriousness was her shield, against chaos, against failure, against fear. Her approach to life, driven by structure, left little room for ambiguity. And humour, particularly the British sarcasm laced through Ron's or George's jokes, thrived in ambiguity. In Order of the Phoenix, when Ron suggests that Hermione might be teaching SPEW lessons to the house elves against their will, she doesn't smile. She launches into a defence of their cause, completely missing the gentle mockery in his voice. This inability to meet humour with humour often left her isolated in light-hearted group settings. She was the one insisting on reading Hogwarts, a history, during holidays, or reminding others of school rules during celebrations. Even during the Yule Ball, a night of glamour and fun, Hermione's tension was palpable. Victor Crumb, respectful but reserved, didn't match her wit either. She spent the evening trying to correct others' behaviour or battling her own jealousy when Ron showed up with Padma. And yet, it wasn't just about humour. It was about connection. Fred and George, while not antagonistic toward Hermione, never developed a close bond with her. Their warmth and humour connected them instantly with others, Lee, Ron, even Harry. But with Hermione there was distance. Not hostility, but mutual misunderstanding. Hermione's intelligence never intimidated them. It simply didn't engage them. They cracked jokes, and she corrected their grammar. In their final year at Hogwarts, even when the castle had become a war zone and laughter was rare, Fred and George still managed to raise spirits. They delivered their jests like lifelines. For Hermione, though, the battlefield demanded absolute focus. When Fred died during the Battle of Hogwarts, even she mourned not just the friend they'd lost, but perhaps the chance never taken, to laugh with him, not just at him. One moment that stood out came during Deathly Hallows, when Ron attempted to lighten the mood by pretending to use the Deluminator like Dumbledore had left him a secret weapon. Hermione, rather than smile, rolled her eyes and returned to reading. She later softened, but the initial moment of levity, so human, so needed, fell flat between them. Her inability to accept humor as comfort was not a flaw, but a reflection of her inner burdens. And yet, we also witnessed a softening. Over the course of the series, Hermione did grow. In Half-Blood Prince, she made subtle jokes at Lavender's expense, sharing glances with Harry when Ron fumbled through his relationship. She laughed more easily, especially with Ginny, whose bold honesty perhaps helped ease Hermione's grip on seriousness. It's worth noting that humor in the wizarding world was often a weapon as much as it was a shield. The Marauders, for example, used it to navigate trauma and rebellion. Fred and George wielded it against tyranny. For Hermione, humor was not so much a weapon as it was a puzzle, one she couldn't always solve because its rules were ever shifting. What made Hermione difficult to joke with was not pride or coldness, but a different emotional rhythm. While others moved between levity and gravity with ease, Hermione lived in the deep end. She didn't dip into jokes to escape seriousness because for her, the seriousness mattered too much. Even with Harry, who understood grief through humor, she sometimes struggled. In Prisoner of Azkaban, when Ron suggested that Crookshanks might be helping Sirius Black, Harry tried to chuckle. Hermione, however, responded with fury, not seeing the humor in the absurdity. Her world had rules, moral, academic, emotional, and anything that blurred those rules, even in jest, left her uncertain. And yet in the end, her seriousness became a kind of humor in itself. As adults, when readers reflect on the trio, it's Hermione's stern corrections, her exasperated honestly, and her inability to catch the joke that become charming. She became the straight man in the comedic trio, not always laughing, but making the laughter more meaningful by contrast. The warmth between her and Ron in later years, though filled with bickering, was also built on this imbalance. Ron teased because he cared. Hermione sighed because she did too. The humor they eventually found was not instant. It was earned over arguments, shared danger, and long silences. But when they laughed, finally, it mattered more. Hermione Granger didn't hate humor. She just demanded it come from a place of truth. She had little patience for cruelty masked as jokes, and even less for people who didn't consider consequences. But when humor aligned with justice, as when Fred and George tormented Umbridge, she admired it. Silently, perhaps, grudgingly, but admiration nonetheless. Thus, the legacy of Hermione's problem with humor is more than a personality quirk. It is a window into her soul. A girl trying to do right in a world that rarely played fair. A mind sharpened by books, struggling to navigate the unpredictable landscape of friendship. A heart that, though slow to laugh, beat fiercely with love, loyalty, and the desire to protect. Even if that meant frowning when others smiled. Number 24 misunderstood the spirit of the magical world. There was always something curious about Hermione Granger's relationship with the magical world. For someone who devoured textbooks with an almost religious fervor, who memorized spells before they were introduced in class, and who once brewed Polyjuice Potion as a second-year student, she often seemed oddly out of sync with the deeper spirit of the world she tried so desperately to master. Her intellect was undeniable, her diligence legendary. But intellect and knowledge are not the same as understanding, and sometimes Hermione simply didn't understand. It wasn't just her Muggle upbringing that set her apart. It was the way she clung to rationality, as though it were a wand in itself. Hermione wanted the magical world to behave. She wanted it to be explainable, to have rules, to follow cause and effect the way science did. But magic never promised to make sense. It bent logic, rewrote causality, and delighted in defying the very structures Hermione trusted. And this frustrated her not because she doubted magic, but because she believed in it so much that she wanted it to be coherent. Her confusion was often endearing, at least to Harry and Ron, but it also had consequences. In her third year, when she used the time turner to take extra classes, she saw time travel as a problem of logistics. She didn't consider the paradoxes, the metaphysical dangers, or the way time in the magical world had its own mysterious currents. She managed the schedule with precision, but never fully grasped the oddity of it. "I've been to all of them," she exclaimed to Ron, but it wasn't just about being physically present. Magic had a presence of its own, and in trying to master it by sheer will, she sometimes overlooked its subtle poetry. Hermione's logical mind was best illustrated by her reaction to divination. She found it absurd because it lacked clarity. Trelawney's vague pronouncements and hazy predictions seemed like nonsense to her. She scoffed at tea leaves and crystal balls, declaring that it was all guesswork. And yet magic is not always about predictability. Professor Trelawney may have appeared silly, but she had moments of terrifying insight. When she predicted the return of the Dark Lord, she did not do it by formula. It was prophecy, raw and strange, and it escaped Hermione's framework entirely. Even her relationship with magical creatures reflected her limitations in understanding. Her campaign for SPW, the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare, was perhaps the most glaring example. Driven by justice, she assumed that house elves must feel the same way she would in their position. She saw their servitude and assumed oppression. But the elves, particularly Winky and Creature, had a different cultural logic. They didn't want freedom in the way Hermione imagined. Their loyalty was woven into their identity, and while there were clear abuses, especially in the Malfoy household, it was not a system that could be dismantled simply by knitting hats. Dobby was the exception, and Hermione used him as proof of her righteousness. But Dobby was an outlier. He was eccentric even by elf standards, wearing mismatched socks and craving clothes which most elves found disgraceful. Hermione meant well, but good intentions without cultural sensitivity often become another form of imposition. When she started hiding hats around Gryffindor Tower, hoping unsuspecting elves would pick them up and become free, they stopped cleaning the common room altogether. This wasn't liberation, it was interference. Hermione had not asked them what they wanted. She had decided for them. This inability to grasp the underlying traditions of the magical world went beyond house elves. Consider her disdain for the Hogwarts ghosts. She viewed them as historical artifacts, asking them questions about the past rather than understanding their ghostliness as a magical phenomenon. When Nearly Headless Nick explained his inability to join the Headless Hunt, Hermione focused on the technicalities. His head wasn't severed cleanly, rather than asking what it meant to be trapped between life and death, to be tethered by regret. She was studying them, not hearing them. Hermione also underestimated the emotional dimensions of magical beings. Her attitude toward centaurs bordered on scientific curiosity. During her 5th year, when Firenze began teaching divination, she was more receptive to his lessons than Trelawney's, but she still missed the cultural layers of his presence. Centaurs were proud, ancient creatures with their own complex cosmology. Hermione never tried to understand what it meant for Firenze to defy his herd and teach humans. She saw it as a welcome change in pedagogy rather than a profound act of defiance. The magical world is built on contradictions. Spells can kill and heal, potions can disguise and poison, love can protect against death, and words have literal power. Hermione, with all her brilliance, often wanted magic to behave like mathematics. But magic is more like music, emotional, fluid, unpredictable. Take her attitude toward the Marauder's map. When Harry first received it, Hermione was wary. She was concerned with rules, boundaries, and consequences. She didn't understand that the map was a piece of living magic, forged not from books but from mischief, loyalty, and a deep love for the school itself. Fred and George had given it not because it was useful, but because it was sacred in its own irreverent way. Her misunderstanding extended to magical artifacts too. When she read about the Half-Blood Prince's spells in the 6th book, she was appalled that Harry would use magic from an unknown source. She clung to the idea that spells needed to be learned from approved books, ignoring that magic has wild origins. "You shouldn't be using spells when you don't know what they do," she warned. But the prince's textbook wasn't evil. It was knowledge passed through experience, dangerous, yes, but also deeply human. Hermione could not reconcile the idea that magic could be both brilliant and subversive. Her reaction to Luna Lovegood is perhaps the most symbolic illustration of her disconnect. Luna was whimsical, dreamy, and believed in things that Hermione dismissed as nonsense. Raxburts, Nargles, the Quibbler, all of it seemed absurd to Hermione. She often rolled her eyes at Luna, treating her with condescension. But Luna's beliefs, however strange, were part of the larger magical tapestry. Magic isn't just spells and potions, it's belief, myth, and wonder. Luna understood that. Hermione did not. She saw truth as something to be verified, not felt. In the Department of Mysteries, when confronted with the Room of Love, Hermione was at a loss. It was a place even unspeakables couldn't explain. Magic, at its core, had a heart beyond reason. And here, even the brightest witch of her age had no words. She could analyze the time room, she could question the death chamber, but the room that held love was impenetrable to her. That moment, quiet and profound, revealed the final truth. Some magic was never meant to be understood, only respected. Hermione's limitations were never malicious. They stemmed from a fierce desire to improve things, to make them better, fairer, and more understandable. But improvement without comprehension can do more harm than good. She was often the voice of reason in the trio, but reason alone cannot capture the essence of a world where portraits talk and staircases move. Her approach was clinical when the world asked for something softer, more intuitive. She lived in a world that thrived on contradictions, yet she wanted coherence. She struggled with magical unpredictability. The Room of Requirement, for example, baffled her. Its logic wasn't logic at all, it was need transformed into space. "It's brilliant," she admitted. But brilliance wasn't the same as order. The room didn't follow patterns. It responded to emotion, urgency, and instinct. This was magic at its purest, and while Hermione could use it, she never fully understood it. Even the concept of Horcruxes challenged her. She was horrified, yes, but also fascinated by the mechanics. How could one split the soul? How did it remain tethered to objects? She read about it with scholarly intensity, but the true horror of what it meant to fragment your humanity took longer to sink in. Dumbledore had told Harry, "You are the true master of death, because the true master does not seek to run away from death." That idea of surrendering to mystery was always foreign to Hermione, who sought mastery through knowledge. In the end, it was her heart that grew. Her mind was always strong, but her soul became wiser with time. The war changed her. She learned to listen, not just argue. She came to see that not all battles are won in books, and not all truths are written down. Her empathy deepened. She grew from a girl who believed house elves needed to be freed into a woman who asked them what they wanted. That evolution mattered. Hermione's journey was not just about learning spells or passing exams. It was about learning to see that the magical world is not a puzzle to be solved, but a story to be experienced. That creatures are not problems to be fixed, but lives to be understood. That not all knowledge comes from reading, and that sometimes the deepest truths are the ones we can't explain. For all her brilliance, it took Hermione years to realize that magic wasn't just something you use, it's something you feel. And that, perhaps, was her greatest lesson of all. Number 25. Interferes without asking. Of all the characters in the Harry Potter universe, Hermione Granger is one of the most admired. Brilliant, fiercely loyal and dedicated to doing what she believes is right, she stands as a symbol of courage and intellect. Yet her unwavering belief in her own judgment often pushed her to make decisions that affected the lives of others without consulting them, decisions driven by her conviction rather than consensus. One such action has sparked lasting debate, the memory charm she cast on her own parents before the Second Wizarding War. It was an act shrouded in noble intent, but one that reveals an uncomfortable truth about Hermione's character, a pattern of unilateral interference where she substitutes others' free will with her own. Before she joined Harry and Ron on their perilous hunt for Horcruxes, Hermione performed the obliviate charm on her mother and father, altering their memories so thoroughly that they forgot they ever had a daughter. She implanted false identities into their minds, sending them to live in Australia under the names Wendell and Monica Wilkins. To Hermione, this was the only way to protect them from the dark forces that were about to seize control of the wizarding world. Voldemort and his Death Eaters were targeting the families of known blood traitors and Muggleborns. If her parents had remembered her, they could have been tortured or killed. In her mind, this sacrifice, her parents' memories of their only child, was a necessary cost. Yet the enormity of the choice she made and the silence of those it most affected lingers as a troubling shadow. The ethical question here is not whether Hermione acted out of love. She certainly did. The problem lies in her unflinching certainty. She made a life-altering decision on behalf of two people who had no say in the matter. The lack of dialogue, of discussion, of even the opportunity for consent reveals a deep flaw in her otherwise admirable nature. Hermione often took control because she believed she knew best. And perhaps, most of the time, she did. But knowledge does not grant authority, especially not over someone else's life, memories, and sense of identity. This was not an isolated instance. Throughout her years at Hogwarts, Hermione frequently imposed her will on others in subtle yet undeniable ways. In her third year, she took it upon herself to use the time turner, not only to attend more classes, but also to influence outcomes around her. When she punched Draco Malfoy or freed Buckbeak with Harry, her choices had ripple effects beyond her personal sphere. In their 5th year, when the Ministry refused to teach practical defense, Hermione orchestrated the formation of Dumbledore's army, drawing dozens of students into a dangerous rebellion. Again, she was right to resist tyranny, but her method was to lead, not to ask. People followed her not because they were invited to shape the direction, but because she had already charted the course. The Obliviate incident stands out precisely because of its emotional weight. These were not classmates or school bureaucrats. These were her parents. They raised her, nurtured her, and knew her long before Hogwarts had called. And yet they were stripped of their reality in a moment without warning. There's something chilling in the image of Hermione, wand raised, whispering the incantation that would erase her existence from their minds. She described it only briefly, saying, "I've also modified my parents' memories so that they're convinced they're really called Wendell and Monica Wilkins, and that their life's ambition is to move to Australia, which they have now done." The coolness of her tone, almost clinical, betrays the emotional detachment she needed to carry it out, but it does not erase the harshness of what she did. This capacity to suppress emotional response in favor of rational decisions is what makes Hermione both formidable and at times frightening. She excels at strategy, at logic, at understanding rules and when to bend them. But the complexity of human autonomy often slipped through her grasp. Her love for rules was rivaled only by her willingness to break them when she saw fit, yet always by her own compass, rarely with democratic input. Ron and Harry, more impulsive by nature, deferred to her intellect, and she grew accustomed to setting the agenda. This dominance of opinion shaped the trio's dynamic for years. Her sense of moral clarity can be blinding. In SPEW, the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare, she launched a one-woman crusade to liberate house elves, knitting hats and socks and hiding them in Gryffindor Tower. But not once did she ask the elves what they wanted. Most of them found the idea offensive, even insulting. Yet Hermione pressed on, convinced that if she just educated them enough, they would understand how wrong their servitude was. Her intentions were good, but her approach reeked of condescension. The message was clear: she knew better than they did. Freedom, as she defined it, was the only acceptable outcome. This paternalistic streak found its most extreme expression in the memory charm. With her parents, there was no room for misunderstanding. They didn't even have the chance. There was no letter, no whispered warning, no frantic goodbye, just silence. Then magic. A perfect illusion, a life they never chose, lived in ignorance until the war was over. It is unclear if she ever fully restored their memories. The books do not revisit the aftermath. Did they wake up one day in Australia, bewildered? Did they return to England and resume their lives as if nothing had changed? Or were they forever haunted by a lingering sense of something missing, a void they could never name? That silence, the narrative vacuum around her parents after the charm, is almost as disturbing as the act itself. J.K. Rowling left their fate vague, perhaps deliberately, but in doing so, she allowed readers to confront the disquiet of Hermione's choice on their own. The lack of closure becomes part of the discomfort. Readers are left to imagine what it means to be robbed of one's memories, to lose a child without knowing loss. In a world where love is the most powerful magic, Hermione's spell stands out for its coldness, its precision, its lack of emotional transparency. Her power over others was not limited to her parents or house elves. During the Horcrux hunt, she also took the lead in deciding when they moved, how they hid, and even when they fought. She enchanted her handbag with an undetectable extension charm to carry their supplies, controlled their protective enchantments, and dictated their routines. It was necessary. Ron and Harry were often lost without her, but the imbalance of power was unmistakable. Her word was law. When Ron finally left in frustration, part of it was resentment toward that dominance. Hermione's control, born of competence, became suffocating. Even her return to Hogwarts in the final book was not just about finishing school. She returned to lead the resistance. When she took Polyjuice Potion to impersonate Bellatrix Lestrange, it was her plan, her strategy. The others followed. Again and again she became the moral and tactical compass, unchallenged. But when authority is unquestioned for too long, it risks becoming tyranny in miniature. Hermione never sought power for its own sake, but she wielded it with a confidence that left little room for dissent. Her confidence bordered on certainty. She was almost never in doubt, but doubt is a form of humility, a recognition of one's limitations. Without it, even the best intentions can veer into arrogance. The line between saving someone and deciding for them is perilously thin. Hermione often crossed it, believing the ends justified the means. This is not to demonize her. She remains one of the saga's most layered and admirable characters, but to admire her fully, one must acknowledge the shadows alongside the brilliance. Her upbringing may have contributed to this tendency. As a Muggle born in the wizarding world, Hermione had to fight for her place, her dignity, and her knowledge. She became an overachiever, not only to belong, but to protect herself. This sharpened her intellect into a weapon and her will into steel. But it also taught her that being right was the only way to be safe. Once that lesson took root, she applied it everywhere, even where it didn't belong. There is a tragic beauty in the moment she casts Obliviate. It is a self-sacrifice, cutting herself from the people she loves most, in the name of their safety, but true sacrifice involves mutual understanding. A soldier kisses his family goodbye, a parent shields their child with open arms. Hermione made the sacrifice alone and made it for others without their knowledge. It was not mutual, it was a theft, noble, but theft nonetheless. The strength of Hermione Granger lies in her ability to act, to move when others hesitate, to decide when others freeze. This is what made her indispensable to Harry's journey and to the fate of the wizarding world. But it also made her dangerous. The power to act, when combined with the belief that one's judgment is above reproach, can lead even the kindest hearts into morally grey territory. When readers look back on Hermione's story, they often recall the brilliant spells, the clever plans, and the fierce loyalty. But the real lesson she offers is more complex. It is about the limits of righteousness, about the cost of certainty, about the silent consequences of choices made in solitude. In the end, she may have saved her parents from Voldemort, but she also denied them their truth. In a world where magic can erase memories with a single word, the question remains, who has the right to decide what is forgotten? Hermione answered that question for her parents without asking, and that, more than any spell she ever cast, reveals the deepest truth about her character. Number 26. Undermines Ron's initiative. There was a boy with red hair and a heart too big for his own confidence. Ron Weasley, the sixth son of a poor wizarding family, grew up in the shadow of brothers who had each carved out a reputation before him. By the time he stepped onto the Hogwarts Express, his self-worth had already been trimmed and tamed by years of comparison. But Ron was not devoid of ideas. Beneath his joking demeanor and his insecurities, he held instincts and insights that, if nurtured, could have brought out a strong, steady contributor to the trio's journey. However, that potential was often muffled, and much of that had to do with the way Hermione Granger, brilliant and assertive, responded to him. There were moments when Ron tried to step into his own voice, moments he tried to lead or simply offer a different perspective. But Hermione, sharp and impatient, had a tendency to steamroll him. It wasn't always intentional. Her intellect moved fast, and her mind was often 5 steps ahead. Still, in a relationship, whether platonic or romantic, such a dynamic can stifle growth. Ron's suggestions were frequently interrupted, dismissed, or ridiculed, not just by others, but painfully by one of the people closest to him. Take, for instance, the events of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. When the trio is contemplating how to get past the devil's snare, Ron tries to suggest action. He shouts, "We've got to do something." But Hermione immediately scolds him, saying, "That's not helping." Instead of encouraging his desire to act, she sharply corrects him, setting a tone early in the series that Ron's impulses were reckless and hers were measured. It may have been true in the heat of the moment, but repeated patterns like these began to shape Ron's own perception of his worth in the group. Ron's insecurity didn't appear out of thin air. It grew, watered by glances and tones, by the subtle undermining that often came from Hermione. In the Goblet of Fire, during a discussion about Harry's supposed entry into the Triwizard Tournament, Ron is clearly struggling to process what's happening. Instead of guiding him through it or respecting his need to make sense of things, Hermione becomes combative, suggesting that he simply isn't thinking clearly. "Don't be so stupid," she snaps. The problem wasn't only the content of her message, it was the method of delivery. Harsh corrections, eye rolls, and blunt shutdowns created an environment in which Ron rarely felt his contributions mattered. This dynamic became especially troubling when considering that Ron often deferred to Hermione not just academically, but emotionally. He respected her, he admired her, but admiration turned one-sided in moments where his thoughts were dismissed. In The Half-Blood Prince, during a conversation in the common room about the Slug Club and who had been invited, Ron scoffs at the idea that Hermione is impressed by people like Cormac McLaggen. Instead of acknowledging Ron's insecurity or trying to understand his feelings, Hermione ridicules his jealousy. When Ron tries to say that Slughorn is only interested in famous or talented students, Hermione replies with biting sarcasm, implying Ron wouldn't know about talent. It's played off as banter, but Ron's silence afterward tells a deeper story. Ron wasn't stupid, he was intuitive. In the Deathly Hallows, it's Ron who figures out that the Locket Horcrux preys on their insecurities, whispering to him that Harry and Hermione are better off without him. These weren't just paranoid delusions, they were seeded in truth. The Horcrux knew which thoughts to exploit, ones that already lived in his heart. It whispered that Hermione cared more for Harry, that Ron was always second best, and why wouldn't he believe it? When Hermione rolled her eyes at him, when she scolded his contributions, when she treated his worries as trivial, those moments built the foundation that the Horcrux later used to break him. In the tent, under the crushing weight of fear and failure, Ron snaps, he leaves. But that departure wasn't sudden. It was a long time coming, formed through years of feeling small, unheard, and unwanted. Even then, when he returns, a redemptive act of courage and love, Hermione doesn't rush to forgive. She punishes him for leaving without acknowledging why he left. She doesn't ask what made him go, she doesn't explore the wound. Instead, she builds walls and scolds again, asserting control over the situation. Ron accepts it, as he always has. When Ron does shine, it's often in Hermione's absence. During the game of wizard chess in Philosopher's Stone, Ron leads with clarity and sacrifice. He steps up as a strategist. Harry and Hermione follow his command. That's one of the only moments in the series where Ron's plan is trusted, unchallenged. And it works, but after that we rarely see Ron in command again. When Hermione is present, she dominates decisions. And Ron, learning from pattern, stays quiet or makes jokes to avoid confrontation. Their time at the Department of Mysteries in Order of the Phoenix is another painful example. When they navigate the brain room and other bizarre threats, Ron manages to help despite being injured. Yet Hermione focuses on what he shouldn't be doing, constantly correcting or dismissing his contributions. In one instance, she even says, "Just do what I tell you." The message is clear. Ron's thinking is not to be trusted. Follow Hermione. It's not that Hermione is malicious. She's logical, focused, and often under intense pressure. But her treatment of Ron reflects a blind spot. She doesn't always see the damage her control causes. Leadership requires not only intelligence, but empathy, and that's where Hermione often falls short. Her intellect creates impatience, especially when others don't think or act like her. Ron, spontaneous and emotional, becomes an easy target for her frustrations. In Prisoner of Azkaban, when Ron believes Crookshanks has eaten his rat Scabbers, Hermione flatly refuses to consider his side. She doesn't validate his feelings, nor does she attempt to see things from his point of view. Instead, she defends her cat and accuses Ron of overreacting. This isn't just a disagreement, it's a dismissal of emotion. Ron isn't just wrong, he's ridiculous in her eyes. She gives him the cold shoulder for days, refusing to bridge the gap. Her refusal to listen damages their friendship more than the actual event with the pets. Even in lighter moments, the hierarchy is visible. During their years at Hogwarts, Ron rarely gets credit when things go well. When he wins a Quidditch match, Hermione claps politely. When he solves something important, she's surprised, as if it's rare for him to succeed. In Half-Blood Prince, after Ron helps the team win against Slytherin, Hermione praises him only after she's manipulated the situation behind the scenes by using a Confundus charm on Cormac. The celebration feels artificial, and Ron's victory, like many others, is quietly overshadowed. By the time they mature into adulthood, Ron has internalized this imbalance. In the Deathly Hallows, when they infiltrate the Ministry of Magic, Ron's idea to use Reg Catamol's identity is met with resistance. Hermione questions everything. Even though the plan works, Ron doesn't get acknowledgement. Instead, it's framed as luck or Harry's influence. The cycle repeats. Ron offers, Hermione doubts. Even their romantic development carries the echo of imbalance. Ron's love for Hermione is evident, but it grows through frustration. When they argue, it's because he wants to be heard. And when Hermione gets upset, it's because she wants control. Their love story is complicated not by external forces, but by a lack of emotional parity. Ron feels too much and says too little. Hermione feels strongly but listens even less. The tragedy here is that Ron is not weak. He's a survivor, a fighter and a loyal friend. But his light is dimmed under Hermione's shadow, not because she shines too brightly, but because she never turns to illuminate him. His ideas, rare, raw, unpolished, deserved to be heard. He didn't need constant validation. He just needed space to grow. Perhaps the most heartbreaking example comes near the end. When they are preparing to destroy Horcruxes, Ron suggests using the sword of Gryffindor. Hermione immediately corrects him with textbook logic, doubting its location and properties. But in truth, Ron's instinct is right. The sword does destroy Horcruxes, and it is out there. Instead of supporting that spark of initiative, Hermione extinguishes it again, layering doubt over his voice. The sword would later be retrieved by Ron himself, alone, in a lake, after following the light of Dumbledore's gift. That moment is not just redemption, it's vindication. Years of being told he wasn't enough had to be washed away in cold water. Ron dove in and found the sword, not just the relic, but his sense of worth. He saved Harry, he destroyed the locket, he returned. But the wound remained. Hermione hugged him, she even forgave him, But did she ever fully understand the quiet damage of her sharp tongue and quicker mind? The story of Ron Weasley is not just a tale of friendship and bravery. It's a story of silenced voices, of a boy who could have roared but was taught to whisper. And in Hermione's brilliance lies a blind flaw, the inability to hear someone less certain, less structured, but no less valuable. Ron did not need her to step aside. He needed her to step back just enough to let him try, fail, and rise. It's easy to admire Hermione. She's clever, loyal, fierce. But true greatness in relationships, whether between friends or lovers, is measured not just by intelligence, but by grace. Grace to let others speak, grace to listen, especially when it's hard. Hermione lacked that grace with Ron far too often, and the boy who stood beside her, brave and flawed, bore the cost in silence. Ron Weasley deserved more than sarcasm, more than eye rolls. He deserved belief. For a boy who stood tall in battle, offered himself up on a chessboard, and risked everything for those he loved, being heard would have been the simplest and greatest gift of all. Number 27, emotionally blind to Harry's pain. There were moments in Harry Potter's 5th year when his world felt unbearably heavy. The death of Cedric Diggory still lingered in his mind like a persistent shadow. He had returned from the graveyard with more than just a broken body in tow. He carried a truth too dark and too vast for most to accept. Voldemort had returned, the Ministry denied it, Dumbledore seemed distant, and Harry was left alone with a weight no 15-year-old boy should ever bear. Hermione Granger, always precise, always prepared, stood by Harry's side as a soldier might stand next to a general, loyal, rational, and driven. But she was not always the friend Harry needed during those fractured days. While she never doubted his story about Voldemort's return, and never wavered in her intellectual defense of him, there were instances, clear, sharp, and cold, when her brilliance could not penetrate the emotional fortress Harry had unwittingly built around himself. The summer at number 12, Grimmauld Place, should have been a place of comfort. Instead, it was a house of whispers, secrets, and walls that seemed to breathe grief. When Harry finally arrived there after weeks of isolation, after Dumbledore's calculated silence and the Dursleys' suffocating presence, he was starved for understanding. Hermione greeted him warmly, even tearfully, but when he unleashed his frustration, yelling, pacing, fuming about the silence and the way he'd been shut out, Hermione's response was measured. She listened, but her focus quickly returned to the facts, to what they had missed, to what they must now do. This pattern, subtle but relentless, echoed throughout the year. The most haunting example came in the oppressive corridors of Hogwarts itself, where Harry was tormented not only by nightmares, but by the real-world scorn of his classmates and the sadistic oversight of Dolores Umbridge. "I don't care," he said once, filled with raw despair. "I've had enough. I've seen enough. I want out." The pain in his voice should have been a summons, but Hermione's response was often to bring him back to the structure, the DA meetings, the importance of resisting through order and preparation. She organized the meetings with the diligence of a general drafting a war plan. It was Hermione who conjured up the idea of the Dumbledore's army. She charmed the parchment, recruited the students, scheduled the sessions. Her brilliance shaped the resistance. And yet, when Harry returned from these meetings with fresh scars, mental and magical, she seemed more concerned with attendance than his spirit. After one particularly brutal occlumency lesson with Snape, Harry confided that he felt as though his mind was breaking. Hermione responded by insisting he should try harder and follow instructions, missing entirely the emotional storm that had just swept through him. In Order of the Phoenix, Harry's mood swings were frequent and intense. He lashed out, often unfairly, but always from a place of pain. Hermione, ever the rational voice, would often respond with logic or gentle chastisement. Her heart was in the right place, perhaps, but her words landed cold. When Harry confessed how much he hated being different, how much he longed for normalcy, her answer leaned on utilitarianism, that his difference was what made him important, what made him needed. Harry was not asking to be needed, he was begging to be understood. The Christmas holidays, too, were not kind. While everyone gathered to toast the season, Harry brooded, distant and disturbed. The image of Arthur Weasley, bitten and bleeding, plagued his thoughts. Worse yet, the vision came through him, through Voldemort. He questioned his own mind, his own soul. What if I'm becoming him? He once wondered aloud. Ron looked uneasy. Hermione, though clearly concerned, replied with platitudes and appeals to reason. She told him he was not Voldemort, but she did not take his hand. She did not sit with him in silence. She did not say, "Even if you are afraid of what's inside you, I'll stay by your side." Her love was structured. It had rules. It lived in books, in battle plans, in the quiet certainty of knowing what spell to use and when. But Harry needed something unspoken, a touch, a wordless gaze, a moment of silence filled with unconditional presence. The contrast was even more painful when viewed against Hermione's attentiveness to Ron. She noticed Ron's bruised ego, his insecurities, his need for validation, and responded. She defended him, soothed him, stood by him even when he lashed out. Harry, by contrast, was often expected to carry his burdens alone. When Cho Chang kissed him under the mistletoe, it left Harry confused and shaken. He tried to talk to Hermione about it. She listened, but her analysis of Cho's emotional state turned the moment into a psychological study rather than offering Harry a simple human comfort. He had opened a vulnerable door, and she responded with charts. One of the darkest nights of Harry's 5th year came after a particularly brutal occlumency session where Snape flung him into a memory, not of Voldemort, but of his own father cruelly bullying Snape as a teenager. Harry stumbled back to the common room that night, confused and ashamed. It was a shattering moment, realizing that his father, the man he idolized, had been a bully. Harry needed a friend who would not only hear him but help him hold the pieces of his crumbling image. But Hermione's response was again analytical. "Your dad was young, Harry," she said. "People change." She was right. But she was not present. Harry did not need analysis. He needed empathy. The climax of their emotional distance came just before Sirius Black's death. For weeks, Harry had been plagued by visions of Sirius being tortured. He was certain it was real. Hermione doubted him. You're not exactly objective where he's concerned." She was trying to protect him, of course, but her refusal to believe, to fully emotionally enter Harry's terror, drove a wedge between them. In those moments, Harry felt more alone than ever. Her logic became a prison. Her inability to say, "I believe you no matter what," turned her into yet another wall Harry could not scale. Sirius's death broke something in Harry. The prophecy revealed later told him that he was destined to face Voldemort alone. But Harry had already known that. The loneliness was not new. What was new was the realization that even those closest to him, Hermione, who had stood by him through dragons, trolls, and time travel, could not always see into his heart. Even the very first DA meeting bore signs of this disconnect. Harry had barely agreed to teach. He was overwhelmed, unsure, filled with doubt. Hermione, however, had already drawn up plans, made the list, set the location. Her need for structure, for doing the right thing the right way, sometimes left little room for emotional nuance. She did not ask, "Are you sure you're ready?" She said, "You have to." Later, when the Ministry finally acknowledged Voldemort's return, Hermione felt vindicated. She had been right, Harry had been right, but victory tasted like ash. Harry had lost Sirius, nearly died, and had heard a prophecy that would haunt him forever. Hermione tried to celebrate, but Harry stood by the window, looking at the sky as if searching for a star he would never see again. That night, she gave him a pat on the back, a murmured, "You did it." But he had not wanted a medal. He had wanted someone to tell him it was okay to cry, that it was okay to not be okay. It was not that Hermione did not care. She did, fiercely. But her way of caring was often incompatible with Harry's needs. She saw problems to be solved. He saw wounds to be felt. She offered spells. He needed silence. She built defenses. He longed for openness. When Fred and George Weasley staged their legendary fireworks rebellion against Umbridge, The whole school cheered. Harry laughed for the first time in weeks, but Hermione scolded them. "It's not helping," she said. Maybe she was right. But in that moment, joy mattered more than strategy. And Harry, broken, exhausted and aching, needed that laughter like breath. There is a moment in the Department of Mysteries, as they stand surrounded by death and danger, where Hermione looks at Harry with a flicker of realization. Perhaps for a second, she understands the cost of always being the strong one. But the damage had been done. She had stood by him, yes, but not always with him.